Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank episode number 35. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I will be hosting for you today with both of the boys on the line, Christopher Sofsky and Teld. I just realized after editing the last episode that I always just dox Chris's full name on every single episode, but never mention Teld's name. So sorry if you don't want me to do that, but I've been doing it for 35 episodes now. So if
nothing
people want to find
exciting
Chris,
has happened yet, so just keep doing it. Something cool will happen eventually.
Hey, we're glad to be here with Chris the Limp Biscuit Sofsky.
The Fred Durst of the podcast, obviously, which makes what does that make Teld? Who's the people who hate Fred Durst? Everyone, right?
Well, Teld's Dark Brandon, obviously.
Dark Brandon, as opposed to
his favorite person in the whole world.
Oh my god. All right, well, we're talking about 2024 today. The entire year, everything that happened in 2024 coming at you in one episode. Obviously, we're talking about a Cube retrospective here, so we're going to be looking at the sets that we got in the context of Arena, in the context of Cube, and kind of reminiscing or bemoaning some of the stuff that happened this year. And I think we're going to try and frame this in the context of, like, how was our Cube affected? Actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but you kind of restructured how our cube looked at the beginning of the year. I don't know if you have that on hand.
Yeah, I do.
Because I didn't look at it too closely. If you kind of like backtracked a little bit before we get into everything here, did you notice any like kind of sweeping changes that happened from beginning of year to end of year? Just like the snapshot of the two cubes, where it began and where it ended?
Well, our blue creature section looks really radically different. Shocker.
Man, we had some stinker twos.
Yeah, it's not like a great picture because I tried to follow the blog post to kind of like reverse engineer things, and then like at the end it was like, oh, there's still some MH3 cards in here. This is not right. Like,
yeah, there's like some random OTJ cards in here.
Yeah. So it's not
but
perfect.
Yeah, but it's still good.
Yeah, but I did notice some stuff. Like, do you remember earlier in the year when we were talking about, like, whatever that lackey card? Like, we were really kind of, like, stretching to try to figure out, like, what our, like, last red one-drops should be.
We played that Frantic Scapegoat.
The Frantic Scapegoat card was in here, so that was kind of happening. I still thought that Young Pyromancer was a playable card in the year of our Lord 2024. So red changed a lot. We can get into that a little bit more, but like if you look at the texture of our red burn, like our red burn looks very different now than it did then. Oh, we had Convenient Target in here briefly.
Yeah, my favorite moment with that card was Doug was in a game and he had put it in his deck and was complaining about how terrible it was and it was useless. And then he got into a spot where Convenient Target was literally the only card in the entire cube that would get him the dub, and he gets the win off Convenient Target. It was really funny.
Yeah,
the card did suck. He was right on that, but it was really funny that it was like some instant karma. That one spot, it was amazing.
I think red tightened up this year. I think we had some problems with red, and I think we kind of successfully solved a lot of them.
Yeah. One thing that I noticed was that in the original list for the year we were on, it looks like 4 of the black one-drop reanimatey dudes, like the 2/1s or 2/2s that bring themselves back from the graveyard with various conditions. And we're currently on 2 of them, and I personally think it might even be correct to go down to 1. I'm not sure any of them other than Bloodsoaked Champion are actually good.
I could see that. We can talk about that.
Yeah, let's get housekeeping out of the way here. So I do want to remind everybody, as always, the best way to support the Jank Diver Gaming community and Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. That's where you can come draft with us. You can give us feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, especially Pioneer Masters has been pretty popular with people right now. You can find links to the Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We host tons of scheduled drafts throughout the week, including the Peasant Cube on Saturday night, the mainline Jank Diver Cube, which is going to be the context for our discussion today. We draft that on Sunday nights, Wednesday nights as well. F&M style drafts on Fridays, where our players vote on a cube to play, and we have various guest cubes created by members of our server throughout the week, so there's always plenty to do. Check out our socials. You can find us on Twitter at Jank Diver Gaming. We're also on Blue Sky now at Jank Diver Gaming, though I don't know how much I'm going to engage with that yet, but we are there at the moment. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/jankdivergaming, and you can find Teld streaming, where apparently Chris makes some guest appearances sometimes on twitch.tv/Teld Talks. Or maybe that was the YouTube channel, Teld Talks YouTube channel. Either way, go check out some of Teld's content there. So I think we're going to skip single card discussion. I am looking forward to getting back to single card discussions at the beginning of the new year, because we haven't done one in quite a while, but we're going to be talking about a lot of cards today, so I don't think that we really need to focus on one here. But 2024, I want to ask a question just straight up front, and I'm going to ask you the same question at the end to see like how you feel about it. Before we recap a lot of the sets, how do you think 2024 fared for Cube, and I guess Magic in general? But do you think 2024 was overwhelmingly positive for Cube, or just like net positive, or not super substantial? Where do you guys land on it at the beginning of this episode? I'm going to ask that same question at the end.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm going to ignore the whole Universes Beyond debacle for now, because that doesn't actually impact this year's sets, so I'm going to reserve judgment on that. Insofar as the sets that we got, I think this was a, like, banner year for Magic, actually. I think this was a year where we got some unbelievably sweet sets and cards in terms of Cube designs and in terms of retail sets. I think this was a very, very good year for retail limited. Like, I think the worst set of the year was obviously Foundations, but I barely even qualify that. So here at the end of the year, it stumbled a little bit, but I mean, MKM was a really decent set. I'm not going to say it's an all-timer or anything, but I did enjoy the set. I drafted it a good bit. And then we got two really premium sets in OTJ and Duskmourn, and I know a lot of people are big fans of Modern Horizons 3. So I think the retail sets this year were a huge step up over last year, where we had some real stinkers like One and LCI as like mainline sets that are some of the worst sets of all time. And I think the Cube designs were sweet. A lot of my favorite Cube cards in the current iteration of the Jank Diver Cube were printed this year. And in fact, I think that's probably why I'm so fond of MKM, is when we get to my favorite cards of the year, I think almost all of them were from MKM, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a solid year for Cube. We'll talk about it later, but it is kind of interesting to me that they finally gave us Pioneer Masters, and we kind of realized, like, they've either given us a bunch of the stuff that we would have wanted, or... Wait, okay, so I'll sort of take the question a little bit sideways. One thing that I noticed for Cube this year, for Arena at least, but probably broadly speaking for Cube in general, is... Did you guys notice, like, how many, like, all-time Cube classics we either cut, or when they finally offered them to us, we were like, this isn't even good enough anymore?
Mm-hmm.
That happened a lot this year.
Yes.
That happened a lot. Like, just a bunch of cards that a couple of years ago I would have, like, murdered to have on the client. Like, some people listening to this might think we're insane, but, like, they gave us Dark Confidant this year, and we were like, this is not better than any of our Blacktooths. Which is kind of crazy. V-Click got cut this year.
I think we cut Seasoned Pyromancer this year.
Yeah, we did cut Seasoned Pyromancer. Yeah. We cut Young Pyromancer.
We got former Modern All-Star JTMS, and it's like a C- card.
And it's like fine. Also, I don't know if you noticed, but in the list, even though we don't have the actual like original art for the card on the client, I just changed it to that so I don't have to look at Furry Jace in my list. But yeah, no, JTMS is honestly just okay. It really is just okay. I don't think Snapcaster... I still think Snapcaster is good. Like, I don't see Snapcaster getting cut, but, you know, it's not like a first pickable blue card by any stretch of the imagination, so...
Yeah, they really bumped up the power. I mean, it's to be expected, and we'll see if the trend continues, where 2025 is bumping off the stuff from 2024, but that is a through line that I have noticed quite a bit, especially with MH3 and Duskmourn. Even though we scaled back on both those sets, it's just apparent to me that, like, every new set that comes out, the powerful stuff that we could include from those sets is going to be taking the place of powerful stuff we're already playing, and, like, moving up from there. It's actually, I found it really hard to include cards from new sets, like from the actual latest one or two sets that don't just, like, surpass the power level that we're looking for our cube. A lot of Duskmourn stuff ended up going above the bar from where we expected, but we'll talk about with Duskmourn. So yeah, the power level is rising rapidly, and it does mean sets like Foundations and Pioneer Masters don't hit quite as hard for Cube. Whereas they can still be good retail limited formats. My overall opinion here, I think 2024 was just an excellent showing, at least of like new sets. I really hate foundations. I'm not going to get too much into that. I actually despise foundations, but everything else I thought was great, and I think we're going to feel the difference between this year and next year, I think, once we get to the end of next year. So I'm overall very, very happy. I'll ask that again at the end just to kind of check in after we've talked about and recapped the sets and stuff like that. So one thing I wanted to note here before we get into this is, we're only talking about sets that came to us on Arena because we just don't have experience with the paper-only things. So it doesn't really make sense for us to talk about that. And there are no anthologies this year, so it's really just all of the sets that came out in paper, like all of the mainline sets that came out, plus Pioneer Masters. The things we're not talking about, if you're looking forward to, to best of 2024, if we missed out on a card from one of these sets, we didn't get it on Arena, so we're not going to talk about it. But that includes Ravnica Remastered, Ravnica Clue Edition, Fallout, Assassin's Creed, Mystery Booster 2, which I think was all reprints anyway, and then the Marvel Secret Lairs that came out not too long ago gave us some mechanically unique cards as well, which we didn't get on Arena, so we're not going to talk about them. But everything else is fair game. And I don't know if you guys want to just jump into it or if you have any more big picture things you want to talk about before we start going through the sets for the year.
No, let's get into it.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, let's just start from beginning of the year. The first set that we got on Arena was Murders at Karlov Manor, which you will remember as the set that had a bunch of detective hats in it. I guess people weren't happy with detective hat set. I think this was probably like the least popular set of the year from like public opinion, but this was basically murder mystery set on Ravnica, and interesting that it introduced the play booster era to Magic. I think this was the first set that had play boosters in it, so it kind of affected draft. You'll remember that the play boosters had a slot for the list, which was really cool for us because it was going to be a way for them to reprint a bunch of cards on Arena, but then they promptly never used the list again after this set, so I don't know what happened there, but the mechanics of the set were all kind of like fairly parasitic. You had things like Disguise Cloak as like morph variants. You had Suspect, which didn't really hit that hard. The only card that we even would mention is Convenient Target, and Suspect wasn't a big part of that, right? That aura could have just basically said this creature can't block and not had all the extra text. Clues came back. Collect Evidence was a cool graveyard mechanic, but didn't give us too much. Probably gave us the most controversial card of the year in terms of me trying to defend something with Urgent Necropsy, but
I forgot about that.
Yeah, but we don't need to dredge up that conversation. You can go listen to our MKM review if you really want to hear us get into a heated debate about Urgent Necropsy. And then we also got Case Enchantments, which didn't feel super special either. I think the only one we tried out was the Case of the Stashed Skeleton, which ended up being a lot weaker than we thought it would be, given that it looks like a 2-1 that also demonic tutors. But
yeah, I still think it's fine. We're in this kind of position, though, where like there are we're finally at a point now in at 360 where there are certain slots and certain colors that are so chock full of acceptable to great options that we've probably forgotten that some of them even exist,
Yeah, I mean, the white case that removal spells has been so impressive at Peasant that if you told me it would work in the mainline cube, I would believe you. That card has been a total banger in that format.
What is that case of the Railway Express or something like that?
Something like that, yeah. It deals 1 damage for each creature you control, so it's like a Kibera takedown that then once you attack with 3 creatures, it turns into an Anthem effect, basically. That gives all your creatures
it is really powerful at Peasant. Notable cards, so I think the biggest thing, or at least the biggest contributor for the long term from MKM is the Surveil lands, right? Which we were not on from the get-go. I don't think we added Surveil lands with the very first pass of MKM, but we came back to them and decided to just add all 10 of them. And
didn't we do that once we got the fetches? Like once we got all of the fetches, we just sort of realized we should be playing all of them, or I can't remember.
Maybe that was it, or maybe did we sub out Triomes for Surveil lands?
Yes, we did.
I think we had played a couple of the Surveil lands at first, if I recall correctly. We had tried a couple of them out, and then they had played really impressively, and people asked them for them in other colors. And then once we decided to cut the Triomes is when we went full all 10 of them.
Yeah, okay, that is what happened. So, like, we were doing this thing where we were like, oh, well, these makes more sense for certain color pairs than others. And then we just kind of realized that they were good. And then when we got the full cycle of fetches, we were like, okay, the full cycle of fetches plus triomes is just that's just the fixing's too fucking free. So we got rid of the triomes. We actually went up a dual land cycle in each color, and we made sure that all of the surveillance were included. And I do have to say, I don't know why this is. I don't. But for whatever reason, literally every value deck I play against in Brawl, the first turn is always like fetch Surveil Land every time. They have it every time. And like having done it a number of times myself, if you're not playing a deck with like a turn one play, like typically a turn one play, like you want to get your tap land down on turn one, fetch Surveil Land on turn one just feels so sick. It's just so nice.
I've been doing a lot of editing of old articles for Draft Sim lately that are like, best Rakdos lands, best Dimir land. Like, we update them yearly, so we had to update them with Surveil lands. And I've been slotting Surveil lands really high in those lists to the point where I think you have fetches, shocks, and original duels as kind of like the trifecta of the best lands in Magic. I think Surveil lands are the next best, like right below there. And it is kind of contingent on having shock lands too, right? The like whole fetch shock Surveil land package is kind of what makes Surveil lands good, because it gives you a value play as an alternative to the plays where you need the untapped mana right away. So like I wonder if the shocks didn't exist, if the Surveil lands would be as good, or at least if there wasn't another fetchable cycle of duels, would the Surveil lands be quite as good? They would still be really good, but like it is the fact that they're an alternative to untapped mana sources with shocklands that kind of like completes that whole cycle.
Yeah, the option of being able to have, like, I can play on curve, play with my tempo, or if I need to play something a little slower, especially later into the game too, which I think where Surveil lands really shine is when you have them on turn 5, turn 6, whatever, and you don't really need the extra mana, but you're trying to avoid drawing extra lands. And at that point, it's just a land that says draw a card on it some percentage of the time, and that's when it gets really wild.
I also think it's cool. I know that some cube curators, in an effort to like maximize their fetches, will like break singleton for like 2 cycles of shocks. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that, right? But if that's like a concession you're begrudgingly making to your like mana consistency, but you don't like that you're breaking singleton, cycle out some shocks for a cycle of these. They're really good, and on some turns, depending on what you're doing, it's just straight up better than fetching a shockland is.
Yeah, I mean, it can being able to fetch into Surveil land to put 2 cards into the graveyard for your turn can help you ramp out some of your, you can help you cast your Abornoculus or whatever, utilize your graveyard, which is a big upside on these cards that isn't, I'm not going to say it's not initially apparent because that's what Surveil does, but like, it's not, at least for me, it was not something that just kind of was like, oh, that's what you're going to do with these things some percentage of the time. Right. Like, it was more like, oh, Surveil is like a little better, and, it's cool to have cards in your graveyard. But being able to put multiple cards in your graveyard is actually quite powerful, obviously. It plays out really, really strongly.
I will say, the fact that these exist now, can we please get the Scrylands at uncommon? Like, the Scrylands are obsolete these days because of the existence of Surveil lands. So please bump those Scrylands down to uncommon. Yeah, they just gave it to us in Foundations as rares again, which is super annoying. But so just a quick recap of a couple cards, and you guys let me know which ones you want to expand on here. Novice Inspector, obviously, as a second. Thraben Inspector. There's also Cryptic Coat and Repulsive Mutation, which I don't know how much you want to go into those there, because I think Teld's going to bring them up again later at the end. War Leader's Call as the big Boros Anthem effect that also pings your opponent when creatures come in. Delny's one of the only cards in our entire cube that is a build-around that makes concessions on stats because of how cool it is when the build-around comes together. Because it's a 3-mana 2/2, right? And this is the one that doubles the triggers of any creature with power 2 or less. So like your Blade Splicers make extra tokens. Anything with power 2 or less double triggers any of its triggered abilities. And we have seen people do enough with this that we keep it around, even though we usually don't make stat concessions for cards like this. And then the card I wanted to expand on real quick, and then you guys feel free to jump in on any of these. Intrude on the Mind came out in MKM. This is the 5-mana, Thopter Fiction, I think is what people call it. 5 mana, split the top 5 cards into some piles. Your opponent gives you a pile, you get a Thopter equal to the number of cards that weren't put into your hand. So like you get a body and you get cards. And I think this is super notable because one of our conversation points from 2023 was blue and how blue needed to turn the corner. And I think this card in particular was when I started to feel blue turn the corner, because it was like, oh, card advantage that affects the board is what we've been asking for in blue, for blue to keep up in Modern Magic, and boom, here it was. And the card is still quite good at the end of the year.
Yes.
And I would like to see more stuff like this. So yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, since we're talking about Intrude, if you want to, do we want to just start there?
Well, I want to call out real quick before it gets lost in the sauce. Teld has gotten way more reps in with Repulsive Mutation and is probably much better known as a Repulsive Mutation gamer than I am at this point. But I will point out that I was this card's original stan. Okay, I was.
you were.
Let the record fucking show. Yeah.
The record has shown. It's written down in the annals of history.
Thank you.
Oh, don't worry. We can talk about Repulsive Mutation later. I've got it down at the end of the episode. But yeah, great card. Yeah. So I mean, I think Intrude. I don't know if I'd have it in my top 5 for blue. I haven't actually put in I haven't actually hard committed what I think my top 5 cards are. It's like Malcolm, Time Warp, and Cryptic Coat are probably like the ones that I know are there, and then it's some combination of other cards. And Lockwell. So like if it's it might be number 5, but even if it's not, card is just incredible. Like it does exactly what you want, and basically every blue deck is the cool thing. Like if you're playing a more controlling deck, it allows you to hold up counter magic and interaction on your opponent's turn while also being able to really punish them if they try to play around the counter magic. If you're playing a more proactive deck, like I actually think it's one of those cards that I consider pretty core to the sort of banned or blue-green like flash tricks cocaine deck that we always talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Like I actually think it's one of the core cards of that deck, because what it allows you to do is spend your early turns playing 2 drops and 3 drops, and then you pass with all of your interaction up, but if your opponent doesn't do anything, you just get further and further ahead. And so this card is really just like, when it came out, I think it might have been like one of the top like 3 blue cards in the cube, and it's still amazing. I don't see this getting displaced anytime soon because it just does such a powerful thing. And you think it's bad to give your opponent's choice, but I mean, every split you can make on this card, like it ends up being super good, basically. I mean,
we've seen the 5-0
split
right?
is still my favorite, but yeah, the 5-0 split works. The 3-2 split occasionally comes up. Like I think people 3-2 split more than they should, but I do think the 4-1 split's my personal favorite on average.
It's also just a fun card to resolve, and it is skill test. And I've noticed every time I've resolved it or it's resolved against me, the game pauses for a little bit as like both players think about the scenarios, which not to say like other cards aren't skill testing, but how often do you get that sort of scenario where both players have to like pause in their tracks and actually like think out the lines with a specific card?
Yeah, there's been several situations where I went like, okay, I'm going to make this split. And then like 10 seconds later you go, oh, I could have split this better,
sure.
or your opponent says like, oh, I should have picked the other choice,
Mm-hmm.
This card got pretty panned on the Cube subreddit, which I think is partially reflective of the fact, and I know I bring this up a lot, and I don't bring it up to sound like an arrogant douchebag, but the cards that we get to play with a lot more than the average Cube curator does, just by virtue of how we cube and the size of the community. And I basically saw a lot of like, well, this gives your opponent too much agency, and you guys basically covered this. Like, unless you're already in a really, really, really bad spot, you're gonna generally be able to set up like 2 choices that you're good with. If you think about it, it's like Fact or Fiction that you're adding like 1 mana to make like a variable size flash flyer, which is like really solid. It's like, oh, would you like to make that pizza an extra large for 50 more cents, kind of a thing. One of my favorite things to do with the card is when you separate the piles. Like you go like 4-1, and the card that you put in the 1 pile is a card that is going to be able to abuse the fact that 4 cards went to the graveyard if they don't pick it. You know what I'm saying? Like,
sure, yeah.
We're not playing Treasure Cruise anymore, but one of my favorite things to do would be to go like 4-1. Okay, you can give me 4 cards, or you can give me Treasure Cruise, and if you give me Treasure Cruise, then I'm going to just Treasure Cruise for 1 mana.
Yeah, with a 4/4.
Right, and or alternatively, you can give me 4 cards and instant speed and like a dinky blocker that'll like trade for one of your cheap things or whatever. So yeah, card's great. I think it probably suffers a little bit from people going, well, this is not Mystic Confluence, and no, it is not Mystic Confluence. Very few cards are. But I will say that in the event that we get Mystic Confluence, we're just going to play both of these cards.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on a limb, and I say in our cube that this card is like comparable to Mystic Confluence, but like I don't want to say which one's better, but like sure, it's not Mystic Confluence, but like in our cube, this card's really good. Also, the other thing that I like about it, and this is something that wasn't. We kind of talked about it on the episode, but it's become really apparent to me that this is one of the few ways that Blue has to really punish red haste creatures, because the haste creatures require you to basically tap out on your main phase, and then you go to combat and you're like, okay, well, I'll make a giant thing. You know, this is where you do the 3-2 split, and it's like, all right, I'll make something that's going to trade. Would you rather like have me a big creature in play, or do you want to like trade and let me draw 3 cards or something?
Yeah, I mean, stack it up against like turn 5 Glorybringer, right, where you cast this with the 4-1 split, and it's like, you can give me 4 cards, and I'll chump with my 1-1, but now I'm up 4 cards and I didn't take damage, or you can give me 1 card, but now I'm making a 4-4 and I'm eating your Glorybringer with my cantrip, you know? So yeah, it does actually play fairly well against it, and your opponent almost always has to give you the split that puts more cards in your hand, so you don't just kill their creature, and you still get a chump blocker. So yeah, it's kind of nice there. So that was a big hit from MKM for sure. Any others here that you want to expand on?
I'd just like to mention that Delny was a card that I know we've talked about this on the podcast in the past, but we were on the cusp of cutting the card. And then we bring him up a lot, but one of our drafters, Doug, started just building around this card a bunch.
It's so broken.
Yeah,
it's so broken.
To be fair, he kind of had a point in a sense that when Delny really comes together, you do kind of have something broken going on. Like this card doubling Blood Artist effects, like Marionette Master and stuff like that. This card being able to double your token producers and the battle cry on something like Sanguine Evangelist, where you're double stacking and really pumping your board. It gives you just such a power multiplier when you get it going, that the risk of it being in your deck or like being fragile is kind of offset by the fact that if you untap with it, it's very frequently just this complete and total engine card.
Yeah, well, it was a card that we were eyeballing cutting, not because we thought that the card was bad, but because white 3-drops are just such a ridiculously stacked slot in just Magic in general. That we were like, well, you know, should we play one more just like really rock solid 3-drop, or this card that like asks more from you? And it was going to be its like final voyage, and then Doug put it in a black-white sacrificey aggressive deck where it doubled all of his Blood Artist triggers, as you mentioned. Also, a bunch of the cheap white fodder that he was sacrificing had like some kind of ETB value on it, and in addition to that, none of his creatures could be blocked. So
it has extra text too, right?
Like creatures
power 2 or less creatures can't be blocked by power 3 or greater creatures, I believe.
Right. So in your like aggressive deck that's like stacked with Blood Artist effects, like you like your shit can't even be chumped. Like they basically, if they're gonna block your shit, they have to trade for it.
We've seen this card double Tristani triggers. We've seen this card, doubling your... we haven't had a chance to see this yet, but I could see this card being a card that, like, doubles your Posse Boss or doubles your... what's the card the guy we'll get to from Foundations that raids to make
the Seer Slicer, sure.
Yeah, there's just so many... Because as the cube has gotten more efficient, too, a lot of the cheap creatures that you want to pair naturally with Delny have just gotten the stat lines kind of... The stat lines have gotten lower, not because they're printing bigger creatures than ever, but at the 1 and 2 mana slot, which is really where the Delny cards, you want to be like playing a bunch of spells after you play Delny. So like on turn 4, you want to play 2 2-drops or something like that. Those creatures tend to have about 2 power. And so you're able to kind of just rattle off a bunch of effects. And when you start adding in like the inspectors being able to set you up with like a lot of card draw and things like that, the deck also just kind of has... It just is a deck that ends up being much bigger than the sum of its parts, which is really, really cool. We've also gotten some extra support after that with cards like Enduring Innocence and Split Skin Doll that kind of synergize in this 2 power or less space. So it's like, it's not just one card anymore. It's now like a theme that you could put as a package of cards in your deck, or like a lane to draft into, which I think is a little better signaled with the cards like that existing.
One of the first things that I ever saw it do, and these are 2 really mundane cards that are both at uncommon. Somebody played Delny, and then the next turn they played Clarion Spirit into Enchantment Good Boy, the 1/1 that draws a card.
Spirited Companion.
Right, so they played Delny, and then they untapped, and they played Clarion Spirit, and they played Spirited Companion, and they made 2 1/1 flyers and drew 2 cards.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
Any other hits here you want to talk about before we move on?
Yeah, War Leader's Call is really good. Not much to say about it. I don't find it a particularly interesting card, but it's a very powerful card.
Yeah, that's a good call out. Tim can attest. For a long time I've been bitching about how, like, Boros can have a thematic identity and it's really obvious what it should be. And my whole thing was, I was like, well, Corpse Knight first of all, should not have been an Orzhov card. Corpse Knight is an Orzhov 2/2 for 2 that just has impact tremors on it. And I was like, can we just get like a Boros rare creature that is like Corpse Knight, but like Corpse Knight with like better stats or something? And Warrior's Call isn't exactly that. Glorious Anthem sucks. Impact Tremors sucks. It turns out when you put Glorious Anthem and Impact Tremors on a single card, it's pretty damn good.
Yeah. Last thought here, because we do want to get through all these sets. How did you guys feel about Ravnica with Detective Hats?
It didn't do anything for me thematically.
I love Detective Hats. I'm going to be honest. I wanted every set this year to have nothing but hats.
Yeah, we were on a roll there for a while.
Yeah, I'm big on the meme energy of they should have just committed to the bit and had this year just every set have a bunch of hats.
I didn't hate the flavor of MKM, but a lot of it was very parasitic. So
it was very cheesy. It was cheesy, but like sometimes it's okay. Cheese is delicious. Sometimes it's okay to be cheesy.
Speaking of cheese, Teld, do you wanna walk us through Thunder Junction real quick?
Oh God.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Right. I was wondering if he was gonna do it or not. He did it.
He did.
All right, so in April, we got Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which was kind of a Wild West spaghetti Western sort of theme with a lot of the classic MTG villains. Might have just been every MTG villain ever, all in one gathering. Kind of like the reverse Avengers. There was also, one of my problems with the set was there was like 15 bonus sheets. And by that, I mean, I think there was 2. But they were the big score and the breaking news bonus sheets. So I think it was originally supposed to just have the breaking news, which was like all interaction removal spells, which was a great addition to the format. The retail format would have been much worse had that not existed. And then there was the big score, which was supposed to be a Aftermath style supplemental product, but after Aftermath flopped so bad, they just converted it into the main set by making all the cards mythics, which caused a huge amount of wild card inflation and just generally detracted from the set, I think. But they were all mythics, so they didn't show up often enough for it to be a big deal. For mechanics, we had one of an all-timer mechanic in Plot. This is one of my favorite mechanics of all time. Either you guys want to say anything about that one? Because I love this mechanic.
No, it's just a very clean mechanic that feels like we could have had before. And I the name Plot probably makes it so that it doesn't show up that often, but I'd like to see it again down the line.
Yeah, so we also had Committed Crimes, which more of a peasant mechanic, I think. Ultimately, there's not a lot of cards that were pushed fair enough for our mainline cube for this, but I think it's a cool way of stapling some extra value onto cards. We had Outlaws, which were the pirate, warlock, assassin, rogue, mercenary thing. It was more of a tertiary thing compared to something like ZNR, where Party, which was the warriors, wizards, clerics, and rogues, was a major part of the set. And basically every deck wanted Party in some way. And then there's Spree, which was the basically kicker. And then Mounts and Saddles, which were vehicles at sorcery speed. So overall, I love this set. This is one of my favorite sets of all time. I think it was extremely fun to play. I think it had just really wild turns that gave you the good feelings. You know, you'd post it in the retail draft channel and just be like, oh my God, I got to do this. And sure, sometimes you got bad beats, and like Snakeskin Veil at Common was really obnoxious, and there were problems with it for sure, like every format, but I loved this format. In my feels, I think this was my favorite format of the year.
It was a very powerful format for Cube and just in Retail Limited as well. I mean, we have a long list of cards. This is probably the longest list of cards for any of these sets here, but that's because it also included a bunch of bonus sheets, like you said. I'm glad you mentioned Stoneforge Mystic here, too, because one thing I didn't do when I was outlining these sets was look at special guests, so I'm sorry if I missed any of the big special guests that we got this year, but Stoneforge Mystic was a special guest slot here. Before we talk about actual mainline cards, I did want to mention, first off, this might be the most impactful set of the year for the Timeless Cube. Like, obviously Modern Horizons 3 is coming up, but this set gave us Mana Drain, Pest Infestation, Reanimate, and Fractured Identity off of just the bonus sheet, which is crazy. You know, Mana Drain and Reanimate, especially being on the client, is huge for things like Timeless Cube. And then we also got, from the big score, we're playing cards like Generous Plunderer, Hostile Investigator, and Sandstorm Salvager. But there's also other things like the, Vaultborn Tyrant. We tried out the Lost Jite. There's other cards on that big score that are, like, really powerful cards. Oh, we played Bristlebud Farmer, too, which I think is just, like, egregiously powerful. Just push stats and a lot of value on a 4-drop green creature.
Really annoying card, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the good news is the only good card we got from the set was Bonnie Paul. So. which, by the way, has never graced our cube because Jesus Christ, look at that card.
Yeah,
Very,
Bonnie
very
Paul is
silly
like a
card.
perfect example of like how they can't figure out what to do with Simic other than like it explore. It explores. It's large
but
and it
now,
explores.
but now it really big and it explore.
Yeah, we got some really, really sweet ones, though. I think I like starting off with the card that's first on here, which is Slick Shot Show Off. And this card
Yeah.
is very narrow. I'm just going to specify. This card goes in, like, exactly one shell. You're probably either mono red or you're, like, very light splashing for black or blue.
Yep.
And you are trying to get opponent dead quick. But when you are trying to do that, man, Slick Shot Show Off is one of those cards that just creates those moments turns, right? We have a lot of cards in this cube because we're so tight on space, we like to have cards that create feelings and vibes and moments. And when your opponent goes like, all right, plot Slick Shot Show Off into like untap, monstrous rage, double shock or whatever, and you just get hit for 10, 11 out of nowhere, you're just like, oh man, that is a nutty card.
I had a roto match recently, a mono red deck, where I had a turn where I Slick Shot Show Off of plot into Monstrous Rage into Ember Cleave and hit my opponent for 18. And the sad part about that is they were at 20, so they lived, and I had a Play with Fire in my hand that I could have fired off to face the turn before, but chose not to. And like I was drawing towards Ember Cleave as my potential win there, so like I should have done the math and realized like I should fire off this Play with Fire, and then if I draw Embercleave, win. But I didn't have enough mana to cast the Play with Fire after the 18 damage, so they ended up killing me on the next turn. But I was like, holy crap! I could have just one shot them with this this Slick Shot.
Oh my god. My first time opposite the card was more tame than that, but still just like serious groan. They plotted it on 2. And then the next turn, they played Sprite Dragon and, like, bolted my Mana Dork and hit me in the face. And I was just like, okay, well, I think... And I had kept a hand where, like... And it was silly, because I knew I was playing against as a player. Like, I kept a hand where, like, sometimes you keep a hand where if, like, your Dork dies, then, like, you're just kind of turbo-fucked because you don't do anything on turn 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, the game was over right there.
Yeah, you don't super often get the like hit you for 11 damage or 18 damage or whatever. Most of the time, this card hits for like 3 to 5, but that's still really good on a 2-drop haste creature with flying.
Very good.
Yeah, I think this was the card that it's one of those cards that I think mono red in our cube in the moment is very good, but it's reliant on a handful of cards that are kind of realistically, they're kind of power outliers. They're very much cards that only go in mono red, but when you get them, your deck is very good. And I think this is one of that handful of cards that sort of fit in that shell.
Yep, really good card. We also got Bristly Bill out of this set, which I
Biggest
think
miss of
we
the year
might.
for us?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, because we had Quirion Beastcaller and Sharp-Eyed Rookie already, and we were like, oh, this is just like another grower card, but you're just like not going to trigger it every turn. Well, it turns out that when you have a full cycle of fetch lands in your cube, sometimes this is better than those cards. And I also kind of disregarded mentally when we were originally looking at it, you can sort of put the counters anywhere, so it can either grow itself or it can do like Luminarch Aspirant type stuff, and then there's the activated on it that, you profit from all the lands you've already played. So card's really strong.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered the activated ability as something relevant, but honestly, by the end of this year, and maybe at the beginning of the year, wasn't that relevant? But at least now, sitting here at the end of the year, the activated ability on the card might be the best part of the card. Like, it's such a big threat on so many board states where you've just got a couple of counters floating around, and now your opponent is put in these impossible blocking situations.
Yeah.
We also got the Sphinx that Chris willed into existence.
Oh god, yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
so
monkey paw curls.
I want to talk about this one a little bit. So this was another card that I felt just like the Reddit really missed the mark on. Stoic Sphinx is a 4-mana 5/3 flash flyer that has hexproof as long as you did not cast a spell that turn. Okay, so there were people there was at least one person who said, I don't have a blue beatdown deck in my cube, otherwise this would be great. You don't have to have a blue beatdown deck in your cube for a 5-power hexproof flyer to be an insane clock. Like, you literally don't need a secondary clock. You really don't even need to have another creature in your deck. So there's that. And then I also got a couple of comments that there are better control finishers, and there kind of aren't, guys. There kind of aren't. Like, there are, but like, I mean, if you're still thinking of like control finishers as these big 6 and 7 mana plays that like win the game after you've completely controlled the game, then I think the dynamics of what's possible in control with recent blueprints have really shifted. And if you're not cubing a ton, that might not be very apparent to you yet. But it is really, really, really common with this card for you to just play it on your turn when your opponent is tapped out. Like, you don't even hold up the counter magic, because unless they have like a sweeper or something that is somehow going to race a 5 mana hexproof flyer, it almost kind of doesn't matter what they're going to play while you're tapped out. And the one thing that we talked about when we reviewed the card is, it can become vulnerable if you cast other spells. So, your opponent could theoretically like play to the board, you go to counter that, and the Doomblade or whatever. But when I have this card on board, it radically changes my calculus of what I even need to bother to counter, because if you play anything that cannot race it or block it, then I don't have to counter it. So yeah, I just want to throw this out there. Like, we actually cut this card for being too good. If you don't like hexproof, you should not play this card. The first time that your opponent flashes this in on your end step and then just has an uninteractable clock that kills you in 4 turns, you're going to be like, fuck this card, get it out of my cube. This card is good enough for your cube, I promise.
Yeah, I think one of the other things about this card that is not immediately apparent is that we have so many 2-mana, like 2-power flyers in the cube at this point that you play on turn 2, that once you get your opponent to 14 by hitting them 3 previous times with those 2 drops, you now only have to hit them twice with both of these if you get them into play, or like you shave an entire turn cycle off the Sphinx. And it turns out your control deck only having to stay alive for 3 to 4 turns is a lot easier than having to stay alive to 6, 7, 8, 9 mana. I do think some recent prints that we've got, obviously we cut Overlord of the Mistborns, but I do think like something like Elspeth 6 has finally given, like, if you have an Elspeth 6 in your deck, you can kind of play towards the I'm going to survive forever and just eventually kill you. Like, Grave Titan's sort of another card that you can play and just be like, okay, I'm going to survive until infinity. But I do think one of the advantages of these cheaper cards is that you just don't have to worry about that. Like, suddenly, like, it just so often, like you said, you play the Sphinx on 4, and now you have to find a way to not die for about 3 turns, and you're going to win the game. And that is just a much easier task to do in this cube environment than getting to those super late game board states with the power level and the catch up, like multi-body mechanics that exist, the value engines that exist. Just a super ridiculous card. I mean, and I actually think its best shell was probably just a straight up control deck, but I also think this card was super obnoxious in the quote unquote bogglesy cocaine deck. It's just like the number of times when you start backing this card up with like Tyvar Stand and slip out the backs and stuff like that, it just gets silly.
You can't lose. Yeah. So just to expand on that a little bit, and I'll keep it brief because we have a lot of cards to talk about. But regardless of like what type of game, whether it's Magic, whether it's boxing, whatever game you're playing, sport you're playing, whatever, playing an infinitely long defensive game, eventually your defense will crack somewhere. So if you are attempting to play like a defensive strategy and then reverse the momentum of the game, whatever it happens to be, the faster that you can transition into the proactive player, the better off you're going to be. So a card like this that kills your opponent so quickly, instead of going like interact for 6 turns, play my thing, if I can like cut down your 1-drop, counter your 2-drop, I'm on the play, counter or remove your 3-drop, and then on turn 4 I just drop this and you have nothing on board, like I win, basically. Like, I win.
Yeah, you need to interact like one more time, basically, to
correct.
Win the game. And you don't even need, and honestly, all that stuff beforehand, you really only needed like one of those. If I'm being real, this card races almost everything that is cheap.
Yeah.
And the paradox of this card is that if you play a bunch of cheap things and try to hold up interaction to force your opponent to do something, you don't actually get bothered because most of those things don't race this thing. And if you tap out to play something big, they just counter it. So like you basically have like a 1-turn window to put something big enough into play that can actually pressure this card. So something like a questing beast or something along those lines that actually like threatens to race. Because otherwise, this card just very, very, very silly card.
Yeah. So final note: if your blue control decks have been feeling like they're not turning the corner fast enough, try out a card like this, because this does turn the corner very fast, and while it might look like a blue beatdown card, this is actually a control finisher, is what this is.
Okay, let's move on from there. That's a lot of time on that one card. So I guess three. What is it? 3 steps. Teld has this bad habit, or maybe good habit, in our show notes of like nicknaming the cards instead of writing the name of the card. So I have to then guess what the card he's talking about is. So 3 steps ahead as like probably the best cancel variant we have right now. Bronco, Caustic Bronco that doesn't have Death Touch. The reason we're not playing Dark Confidant, right, is we just feel like we have the best Dark Confidant right now.
I was wrong about this card.
I was going to say, I thought this was going to be worse Dark Confidant. It turns out most of the time it's just better.
Yep. And then Honest Rutstein, like, huge sleeper from the set, I think. Mostly because it's an uncommon, right? This is the 1 black, green, 3/2 that grave digs a creature back to your hand and also makes all your creatures 1 less to cast. Like, this is obviously, like, incredible at Peasant, but I think this card totally holds up in the mainline cube as well. I think it's very, very powerful Golgari card. And then these other ones, I don't know if you guys want to expand on any of the bonus sheet stuff that I've already mentioned. I talked about the big scorecards like Hostile Investigator and Sandstorm Salvager, but I didn't really say anything about them. So if you guys have anything you want to add to the big score stuff, I will say the big score stuff was very annoying for us because everything was shifted to Mythic Rare, even though some of them were originally uncommons and rare. So I thought that was a pretty shady thing for Wizards to do when they toss these cards into the set, but at the same time it is just more cards that you can choose to opt out of if you don't want to play them. But it is just a bunch of Mythic Rares, and we are on I think 3 of them right now. Maybe I missed 1 or 2.
Yeah, I want to point out Sandstorm Salvager specifically as a card that I don't really see it a ton because I don't really know why, actually. I feel like I should see it more in the cube than I do. But it's a card that went from having very minimal synergies and sort of seeming like a card that just sort of self-enabled and maybe you'd occasionally tag a couple extra tokens to now having a multi-layered synergy where, especially in green-white, we have both token themes and +1/+1 counter themes, and this card anchors both of those things while also being an exceptional rate on body. So I just wanted to point that card out. I think this card's fantastic and probably should see more play than it does.
Yeah, it's a good card. I like seeing cards in green that are just solid on stats, so they're worth putting in your deck, but also have token synergies to cross-pollinate better with like Selesnya stuff. Always a fan of cards that are just good that also kind of open up synergies and color pairs that traditionally don't really have them. Another just quick shout out, and I know Teld likes this card even more than I do. Hostile Investigator is a cool card. It's a cool card insofar as like I like that it's just a really solid black mid-rangey thing that does black things. It's not like thematic necessarily or whatever, but for those of you that don't know, Hostile Investigator is 4 mana for a 4/3. When it ETBs, target opponent discards a card, and then whenever one or more players discard 1 or more cards, you investigate. So baseline, it's like a 4/3 for 4, which is not an exciting stat line, but it's a 4/3 for 4 that like it makes your opponent discard and then you investigate, so delayed card advantage. But if your opponent is ever discarding cards to like loot, or you're forcing them to discard with like Thoughtseize effects, or you're looting, or you're discarding cards to bring other cards back into your hand or whatever, that clause, like you or them, like anybody discards a card. I've seen this card investigate like 3 or 4 times in a game before, and ultimately edge out the wind in a grind fest. So it's not like the most exciting card that like ever carded, but it's actually a really solid little mid-range black thing.
Yeah, it's exceptional as kind of you play it in all your black mid-range decks, but it's also just a pretty good card into like as a pivot card in your control decks. It doesn't look like it, but it just taxes your opponent a bunch of resources, and then because it says whenever 1 or more players discard a card, it plays well with blue looters. So if you've got like a Malcolm in play, you can investigate every turn and just start generating a bunch of card advantage. So it pairs actually well with a lot of the blue cards as well, which is gives it some play into control decks, which is cool.
Also plays well against them as well.
Definitely cool.
So a lot of really powerful stuff coming out of OTJ. To wrap up this set, I did want to ask, what was your guys' opinion of like, because this was also super controversial, all of the returning characters, like, oh, here's every bad guy from Magic's history showing up on OTJ. Like, there was a lot of stink about like, oh, this is March of the Machine, they're going to be doing this a lot, it's just cheap to like bring back every legendary creature that people know about. Did you guys have any opinion about that?
It was hilarious, and I loved it.
I think you might be in the minority there. I'm going to send you guys a picture real quick. I don't hate it either. I discovered that the commander decks that came out with OTJ had these things called bounties where they had I don't know how they work. I never played with them, but it's a bunch of characters that they created for this set. Like there's Squeakers the Sly, and there's Risa the Blades Lee, and Fleeting Filcher, and they have all these cool names and stuff. And I can't help but wonder, like, why they didn't use these characters in the set instead of bringing back a bunch of old characters. It felt like if you're gonna make all these characters, why not use them and like give them some, some time in the spotlight instead of like bringing back all these like nostalgia bait cards like Marchesa and Satoru Umezawa and stuff like that. It feels like a wasted opportunity on all of these extra creatures they made.
Okay, having said what I just said, I did really enjoy it. I thought it was really funny, but these cards kind of rock. I would have liked to have seen these in the set. The arts are really cool looking. They're very, very nifty and unique.
Yeah, there's more than the ones I just sent the little snapshot of too, so...
Maybe we missed some opportunities there in market. I think there were some of them that worked better than others. Like I really liked the Caravet callback, and I actually kind of liked the Marchesa one, even though it's kind of like, what are you doing on?
Yeah, why are you here?
Yeah, why are you here? Yeah, look, this is a set that I think to enjoy it, you need to suspend your disbelief, put aside any thoughts that this is a game with a coherent plot line, and just enjoy. I think this was very much a set of like, can you turn your brain off and then just enjoy the silliness? And I was able to do that, but I understand why a lot of people couldn't.
All right, well, let's get into the big whale of the year. Modern Horizons 3 came out in June. This included the new to Modern bonus sheet, which was a bunch of cards that are first-time prints for Modern, but for our purposes just means more cards on the client. There wasn't like a single story or plane going on here. The Modern Horizon sets are just kind of check-ins on Magic in general across all different timelines and stories, but there were kind of three major buckets that the whole set was built around. There was Eldrazi, Energy, and Modified, and I would say that Modified thing ended up being like very flat compared to Energy and Eldrazi. If you keep up with Constructed, Eternal Constructed at all, you probably know that Energy is running rampant in the world right now.
Yeah, we're 0 for 2 on Modified.
Duskmourn, I think, is actually a lot closer than it seems, but this is easily the most powerful set of the year, as we would expect from the Modern Horizons brand, to the point where, like, not only did we do that Development Diaries episode where we scaled back a bunch of MH3 cards, but like we broke our cube with a couple cards, like straight up broke it with a couple additions, and then like we're actively still looking to see if we should just like cut cards with the MH3 symbols on them, because for any given effect, any given slot, the MH3 version of the card is just better than whatever else you could be running. Like name an MH3 card. Like, in fact, I didn't even list every card that we cut because I said it would probably be easier to name the cards that didn't break the cube, but like Flage, Psychic Frog, Ocelot of Prides, Guide of Souls, like we're talking about Neithergoyth recently, like even card like Marionette Apprentice, which is like I think a fair power level for our cube. It's clearly just like the best Blood Artist we've ever gotten. So everything we have.
Yeah, the one I can think of is like Detectives Phoenix, maybe, or because like we were even talking about the black green one as a card that is like very frequently just like 2
White
mana,
of the Reliquary, 2
mana 5/5 with upside. I mean, Detectives Phoenix, for what it's worth, when you pop off and you give like a big creature flying in haste and a big stat buff, it does feel like cheating for 1 mana.
Because I mean, Jesus, and I'm not even talking about cards that we never even put in our cube. Like we got the Evoke Elementals, the MH2 Evoke Elementals from the special guests here. Yep. We're not putting Fury, Solitude in our cube, stuff like that. I mean, I'm glad you actually wrote this one down. Malevolent Rumble, a random common from the set, like the 2 mana, look at the top 4, put a permanent in your hand, rest in the graveyard, make an Eldrazi spawn. Excellent card, right? Like
really good card. The Repurposer is good too, and that's just like
yeah.
I mean, don't get me like Centaur Courser has not been like a relevant design sort of like marking point in a really long time, but consider that they used to print Centaur Courser in an MH3. They printed a Centaur Courser that makes an Eldrazi spawn when it enters and when it dies. So ultimately, once you trade it off, it was a 3/3 that cost you 1 mana, and that's a common. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this set because I feel like we could say a lot. I think that this has got to just objectively be, in terms of just like generically powerful cards that you can put in your cube, this has got to be like the most stacked set that they've ever made. It makes the first Modern Horizons sets look fucking reasonable.
It does.
Yeah, I have no love for the set.
Yeah, I thought when we were reading the cards, I felt like they looked like they were more synergistic, and it turns out they just end up being just way better than everything else. I do think the more powerful your cube gets, especially if you're playing like a tight 360, as time moves forward, as we get more Duskborns, as we get more of these sets, I think these cards will fall more into line in the absolute top echelon of power. But even in our most powerful environments, like Doug and I have a super powered Fair Cube, and even in the Timeless Cube and stuff, cards like Psychic Frog and Guide of Souls are just so unreasonably good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember saying when we were reviewing this, when we did our final wrap on the MH3 review, I remember saying something to the effect of like, "Oh, I think they learned they learned their lesson from MH1 and MH2, and they're trying to tone it down and make things more synergistic." And that might be the dumbest thing I've ever said, like in retrospect, like, because like when you read Ragavan for the first time, you're like, Jesus Christ, what are they doing? But when you read Ocelot Pride or Guide of Souls for the first time, I didn't get that feel. I didn't get that Ragavan feeling, right? But then you play the card, and it's like, oh, my Ocelot Pride made multiple Blade Splicer tokens and a cat token because I gained a life when my Blood Artist triggered this turn without even having to attack, and it's like, that is unacceptable for a 1-drop. Like, get out of here with that shit. Or like Guide of Souls into like 2 bodies into like, oh, now I'm attacking you for 3 on turn 2 with my 1-drop or whatever, and it's like, shut up. Like, that's stupid.
Reads, the cards read like there's some deck building cost or like synergistic opportunities you have to cost, but it turns out it's just so easy to do it that it doesn't actually, it's like it's a fake hoop to jump through.
It's like Amped Raptor, right? Which is like has ups and downs in our cube and is actually still in our cube, but like when you look at it constructed, it's like, it's not really an energy card. You just build a deck with a bunch of 1-drops and 2-drops, and it's like, oh, here's this 2-drop that just spotted you a free creature. You know?
Yeah.
I do want to specifically mention Thonian Nightmare and Nadu, which I'm going to mention Nadu again later on, but I think from a cube designer perspective, these 2 cards were obvious mistakes to put in our cube. Thonian Nightmare a little bit less, because you can kind of see like, oh, it makes you work a little bit, but I think we can all agree we never should have put Nadu in our cube.
We knew it at the time, it just we didn't know it as hard as we should have known it. I think MH3, the entire premise behind MH3 was that they could put another 3-mana Simic design mistake and like have an excuse to do it.
I think where we landed is we thought Nadu would be like a 9.5 in a cube of 8s, and it turns out Nadu's like an 11 in a cube of 8s.
So I this is my favorite Nadu story, and it is the only time my 1-3-0 deck, surprise, surprise, I 3-0'd with Nadu in my deck, that it got immediately banned because I was like, no one else can have fun with this toy. Someone targeted my Nadu, which I had tapped out for, and I drew a card, and the top card was a forest, which it then inexplicably put into play at instant speed untapped, which allowed me to target my own Nadu with the Tyvar stand in my hand to draw another card and play another land and not lose my Nadu. That happened.
Yeah, so, during the review episode, we also mentioned that we didn't think that you would do the equipment thing very much with Nadu, and in that same evening, in like round 3, he boarded in a Bone Splitter, and he played Nadu into Bone Splitter, and his opponent immediately scooped because they didn't have a removal spell, and he was about to draw his, spend 1 mana to draw a card a bunch of times.
Yeah, a bunch of times. Yeah, just a really silly card.
In that review, we were like, oh, this would be fun with Bristly Bill. And then sure enough.
Yeah.
And you guys know the story on Nadu was that it was changed last minute because it is a super controversial card for the entire year, right? Kind of ruined some Pro Tours, I would say, made for some really terrible Pro Tour coverage. And then it was changed last minute before MH3 shipped so that it would play better in Commander. So that really stupid line, I hate to use the word stupid actually, but that really stupid line of triggers only twice each turn was like never tested at all, and was just thrown on there, and it was like, wow, they really screwed a bunch of formats with this by trying to make it like Commander friendly and not testing the card. So, and I think our fault was, or at least if you want to take a design lesson from this, is if you think the regular play pattern for a card is going to be something unfun, then don't play the card, right? Like, if that's what you're expecting to see out of it and you don't want that in your cube, and that's what you think the use case for a card is going to be, you don't need to try it out and see if it does that. that's not going to be fun for anyone. So I would say Nadu was like a huge miss in terms of like we shouldn't have played it at all. Thonian Nightmare took a little bit to prove itself, but I think was very clearly busted from the get-go as well, as far as like, if this does the thing we're expecting it to do, it's going to be an extremely unfun experience for someone, you know?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to keep that in mind. And then last thing from me for MH3 is I don't think you can really talk about this set without talking about Writhen Chrysalis. Maybe the best like limited common of all time, which has not graced our mainline cube. Honestly, could like be fine in the mainline cube if we put it there. It gets a lot of gripes in our peasant cube, even though I think it's totally fair in the peasant cube. But in the retail limited format, like Jesus Christ, this card was like a defining feature from day one. The 4-mana 2/3 that makes 2 Eldrazi Scions, and then whenever you sack an Eldrazi, it gets bigger. This card was just super unreasonable when you could get multiples next to each other or surround it with other Eldrazi Scions. So
yeah,
like,
this is why I bounced off the format as the sort of, I always called it Eldrazi Pillow Fort, but just the sheer number of chunk blockers you could make that also advanced your game plan, ramped your mana, like, and having multiple Chris's.
For what it's worth, I think that evened itself out by like week 3 or 4. But like, if you're talking to people who only engage with a limited format for like 1 or 2 weeks, like Combine Chrysalis was the defining feature of MH3 limited. And we still get like, it's funny that people complain about this card in the peasant cube, because I've never seen it just like carry a game. It is good, it is strong card in the peasant cube, but we'll talk about more with Danelius when we talk peasant cube. But I think that goes hand in hand. Like, MH3 comes to mind, 2 things come to mind for me. It's Nadu and it's Combine Chrysalis. Or not Combine Chrysalis, but Writhen Chrysalis. So any other big thoughts on MH3 here? It's just, it's easy to say this is just a blanket super powerful set, and like we've opted not to play a lot of the cards or cut back on them.
Yeah, let's just put it in the rear view.
Okay. MH4. We'll look forward to MH4. We won't make the same mistake with
Final
MH4.
Fantasy set?
Maybe. Chris, do you want to walk us through Bloomborough?
Yeah, Bloomborough was a really cool set. A very, very obvious kind of like ode to Redwall, which was a series of books about anthropomorphized, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, creatures in kind of like a medieval setting. Really, really nice part of my childhood. I think the art in this set was better than it has been in like years. The art was just incredible throughout. A lot of really touching pieces, a lot of just really sort of evocative pieces. It just was a really, really great set from a thematic standpoint. I think like one of the biggest slam dunks in that respect out of a set in a very long time. And there were some good cards in it. So there's the mechanic, the Offspring mechanic, which is kind of like, it's essentially like Kicker. Everything's Kicker, right? And when you pay the Kicker cost, you just make a 1/1 token copy of the original card, which in a lot of cases, results in some really cool stuff. There's a 1-drop in this set called Iridescent Vine Lasher. It's a 1-mana 1/2, I believe, that nugs your opponent for 1 every time you play a land, but it has Offspring for 2. So if you pay 3 mana, you get basically like a 1/2 and a 1/1 that both have that text, which represents a lot of damage over the course of a game. Just some really cool stuff like that. There's the gift mechanic, which I personally found to be kind of odd, because you can either gift a card or like your opponent draws a card, or like fish tokens for some reason.
You don't give people fish as gifts?
Not generally. Actually, the one time that I did quote unquote gift someone a fish, it was as a prank on a frat house. We stapled one behind their porch couch so it would rot. They got really angry. Yeah. So they sucked. We hated those guys. They would have parties and drunk people would like puke on cars in the neighborhood and stuff. They sucked. But anyway, yeah, you could gift like a card or fish, and then whatever the card is, it gets some kind of additional benefit. One of my favorites from this set is kind of like, I think Tim framed it as like, this is what I want Reclamation Sage to look like. It's called Scrap Shooter. It's 1 green for a 4/4 with reach, which is a fine stat line for a creature. And then you can gift your opponent a card, so you can allow them to draw a card when you play the card. And if you do, it Rec Sages something. I don't know if in every case it's just better to have Rec Sage that draws your opponent a card but gives you a 4/4 reach creature instead of like an anemic little 2/1. But I'd say that that's a pretty fair trade in my mind a lot of the time. And then when there's no target, it's just a 3-mana 4/4 reach, which is good. You want to talk about the class enchantments, Tim?
Yeah, those came back from AFR, which I thought they were really, really cool from AFR. One of the only cool things from AFR, honestly. They didn't quite hit the same here, right? Because those the original ones were like based on D&D classes, and these were based on like jobs and careers and stuff. And a lot of these were super narrow, but we did get Hunter's class, I think, is maybe the only one we're playing in the mainline cube, which is just an excellent punch spell, right? It's basically Rabid Bite, but you can level it up to give some combat bonuses and some card draw later in the game. So that one's really cool. And there's a lot of other ones that have some constructed impacts. I will say, again, putting it on the record, that I would really love if class enchantments came back in Strixhaven, because it would be such a flavor win. But it's been pointed out to me that due to translations to other languages, that might not actually work the way people would want it to. But yeah, class enchantments are really cool, even though I think this round of class enchantments didn't hit quite the same, because they're kind of like really narrow. Like, think about the bandit class or whatever, bandit's talent, that's doing like discard synergy stuff, and the builder's talent, which is doing artifact enchantment synergy stuff. There was a lot of that going on for these class enchantments, but hunter's talent was a huge win for the set.
I think overall, these talents were actually ended up being much more powerful than the original AFR enchantments, but they do so in such narrow ways that makes them core cube cards. Like, Caretaker's talent is, I don't know if it's quite standard all-star anymore, but it was being a very powerful constructed card. I think it's Scavenger's talent, the one that makes food, is like legitimately a mainstay of Sacrifice that has brought it back in the Pioneer metagame.
Storm Chaser's talent's a big one right now too.
Yeah,
that's
combo piece
the one
and
that makes
standard.
a 1/1 prowess, and then you can do some combo-y stuff with untappers and things.
And our artist talent has displaced Ledger Shredder in most Phoenix builds at this point as just a better enabler. So they
had to get that one in there.
One per episode. So they were very, very powerful, but they're just narrow in their applications, which makes them more constructed cards than they are cube cards.
Mm-hmm.
Forge exists. It was the squirrel mechanic where you can sack a food or exile 3 cards from your graveyard to get an extra effect. I don't think we're playing any Forge cards in the mainline cube at this point.
No, we had Osteomancer, the Osteomancer Adept.
Yeah, and then we had my favorite mechanic from the set, which was Valiant, and man, I want to see this one again. It's basically an improvement over Heroic, that when you're targeted by a spell or an ability for the first time each turn, you get to trigger it. So it's limited how much it can trigger, and the effects tended to be a little weaker, but it is insane how much easier it is to slot these cards into cube. Like, this is the opposite of the talents, where they were much more narrow. Valiant is much more broad in that you accidentally trigger Valiant all the time if you've got a Valiant creature in play.
Valiant is great. It just happens that it only appears on like a small handful of really good cards, like Heart Fire Hero. And the exchange is that you don't get those turns where you like kind of storm off with your heroic creature or whatever, but you do basically get to trigger Valiant like every single turn. I guess that's not true in the mainline cube, right? We're playing a Ember Heart Challenger, I think is what it's called. That's the 2-mana 2/2 haste prowess, and the Valiant doesn't come up on that too often, but it is nice when it does. But in the Peasant Cube, where you have a couple more equipments and stuff like that, like just a piece of equipment laying around like a Bone Splitter or a Rabbit Battery is enough to trigger Valiant every single turn without having to draw into combat tricks or auras or anything like that. So Valiant, I would like to see a lot more of moving forward.
You know, we haven't seen it yet, but it was just occurring to me that if you played the Challenger in the Naya Spectrum decks, we usually see it in more the Grixis style decks. But if you played it inside the Naya Spectrum, you could probably trigger Valiant a lot more often. You trigger Prowess less, but you probably draw more cards off of it.
Sure. I mean, you go Emberheart Challenger into Ornery Tumblewag, like you're just drawing an extra card every turn that way, assuming everything lives. The last mechanic worth mentioning here was Expend, which I find very interesting because Expend was tied to the green-red raccoon beatdown deck, and that mechanic basically said if you spend 4 or more mana on spells during a turn, you get some sort of benefit, but all the benefits were like stat boosts, right? Because it was a red-green mechanic. But there's nothing that says Expend has to be a red-green mechanic. So I would like to actually see this kind of repurposed later on down the line as like a mid-rangey or controlling mechanic where you see like, you know, like a draw engine that's like, oh, if you expend 4 every turn, draw a card, you know, that sort of thing. So that's a mechanic that I think has a lot of application down the line, but was used for a very narrow purpose here. So it's not an all-timer mechanic like Valiant or Plot or anything, but I do think there's some room for Expend to show back up later on down the line. One thing worth mentioning with this set, the reimagined critters was this kind of, I don't even know if it was a bonus sheet because I don't think you could open these cards in Limited, but it was a bunch of basically Commander supplementary cards that were reprints of existing Magic cards, but with the art reimagined as furries, as animal creatures. So this was where we first got Jace the Mind Sculptor and Elspeth Elspeth Conquers Death. Elspeth Sun's Champion, but as a mouse and a fox, you know? So if we want to play Jace the Mind Sculptor on Arena right now, we have to play Foxy Jace, because that's the only one we have. We did also get Birds of Paradise, though, which was a huge win. In fact, Bloomburrow in general was a huge win for Mana Dorks, right? Because we got Birds of Paradise and we got the Tender Shoots Dryad or whatever it's called, like the raccoon with Offspring. So we got a nice little boost to our Mana Dorks here. Birds of Paradise being a classic for sure. So I kind of combed through Bloomburrow. I didn't find a lot of exceptional cards to talk about, but Heartfire Hero is more suited towards Peasant. Kitza, Otterball Elite, really cool looter. Probably not as blatantly strong as Malcolm, but like definitely a super cool card with a lot of applications to it. And you guys have Beza listed by a different name here. Mm-hmm. Season of Loss. Yeah, Season of Loss is a really cool one. Oh, the paw print thing, right. The paw print thing felt a little underused. It felt like they could have done that a little bit more. It only appeared on those mythic rares, but Season of Loss was a nice black pickup.
Yeah, it's a very cool card.
Yeah, modal Wrath draw engine damage dealing effect. It's been very, very solid. Yeah, I think this one probably currently sees less play than it should as well. I think Black Sack hasn't been in a spot that people really want to force it. I think probably because it's got a bad blue matchup and blue is perceived as really, really good. Only insofar as that there's so few cards that matter that blue will just counter the like 3 cards that you play that matter, and then all your dorky dudes do nothing.
Mm-hmm. It is nice too that this is a sweeper that like you could just put it in your control deck and ignore a lot of the other stuff, and it can be 5 mana wipe the board, which using a sweeper slot on a card that's flexible like that kind of gives me the Meat Hook Massacre vibes without being as like absurd as Meat Hook Massacre is. So
yeah, a sweeper that's maximized in sack. Yeah, that's just a lot more fair.
Yeah. You added Beza to this list. Was there something specific you wanted to say about Beza?
Oh, I just thought the card was great. I really love cards that provide catch-up mechanics. I know that it plays to its best in the slower, more control-y decks, which have been doing very well lately. So we recently kind of put it into the toolbox of stuff that we'll use if aggro gets out of hand, as opposed to something we're running at the moment. I just really like the design of it. The art's beautiful. The design was really quite elegant. I like that the further you are behind, the better a card it is. The further ahead you are, the worse it is. I sort of like that design. I'm a fan of any design that makes it a little bit easier to be on the play and a little bit worse to be on, or excuse me, a little bit easier to be on the draw and a little bit worse to be on the play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a cool design. I will also say, please don't sully its good name by referencing that like evil dipshit. Please, like, don't do that again.
For those, I don't know if you mentioned it, Tim, but I have it in the notes here. Mentioned it as Elk Bezos. That's what I've been calling it since I think we saw it spoiled.
I was told I'd be taken off payroll if I mentioned it. So yeah, good luck feeding your family or whatever. Yeah, I mean there's other cards that we could pick out that we're playing, but there's a lot of like offspring creatures. You mentioned the Vine Lasher. There's like the Warren Guard. There's the Tender Shoot guy. A lot of, I would say, reasonable power level cards. There's nothing broken in Bloomburrow, right? Like compared to OTJ, compared to MH3. What am I missing? There's something
not at the mainline level. No. Yeah, Peasant is a different. Peasant Cube's going to be a different story.
Sure. Yeah, when you start talking about Heartfire Hero and Hunter's Talent at Peasant, like those cards are all timers for sure. But yeah, I think this was like maybe the most fair set of the year. Not great for retail limited, but I'm willing to excuse that because of the flavor of the set and how much of a slam dunk it was in terms of card design.
Yeah, that's more or less what I was going to say. This is a set that I think is a good example of a set being absolutely amazing in everything except the cards themselves in terms of cube/retail. Like the retail set was pretty mid unless you're a certain person in our Discord. Peak. And I think the cube designs were ended up being kind of a little more narrow. There's a lot of sweet designs in there, but they go in very specific homes as opposed to more generically powerful cards on average. And that's okay. It's okay to have sets like that are more about vibes and about like the design of the set. This set was really, really cool. Everybody kind of collectively, I think Magic World agrees this set was probably the best set of the year in terms of design. Like just the way that it looks, the way that it feels when you look at the cards.
Yep. And then we got the wonderful culture shock of a set full of woodland creatures and offspring which were obliterating the offspring that we were sending into battle. So
yeah, oh my god.
There was definitely a shift of tone, a tonal shift between Bloomburrow and Duskmourn being the very next set. But you know what? I'm here for it.
It's funny about Bloomburrow that like I think that they made the theme like super cutesy to distract from the fact that the set's actually about child soldiery.
Yeah, well, dude, fuck them kids. Send them shits off the war, man. I'll edit that out. Don't worry. Okay, Duskmourn. I mean, Duskmourn House of Horror hit in September, and we're starting to ride on sets that we've talked about more recently. So I think especially for Foundations and Pioneer Masters, we won't have too much to say that isn't just like reiterating what we said a month ago or so. But Duskmourn came out in September. This was probably the biggest set in terms of world building. Like they had tons of articles about how the mansion worked and how the house worked and where it came from, but essentially the idea was like this was just a gigantic haunted mansion, which was also just a demon who like grew to power, took over a plane, and like forced people from other planes into like a big house of horrors. So 80s 90s horror influences, some of it very much on the nose, some of it didn't really vibe quite as well. It was kind of trying to do two things at once flavor wise, where it was trying to be like the big haunted mansion trope, but also trying to do a bunch of like movie horror references like Poltergeist and The Shining and stuff like that. And all of the like real world references I felt like were super on the nose and I didn't really vibe with, but I really liked the creature design and the haunted mansion and the idea of Valgavoth and stuff like that. So I would say this like half hit for me and half missed for me. But man, tons of world building going into it, into like the logistics of the set and stuff like that. And I know you guys were kind of split on it too from a flavor perspective, right?
It didn't do anything for me.
I'm less down on it now, but part of that is because this set was so good. I look, OTJ gives me feels. I don't know. I know I'm in the minority on that set, but like I really vibe with OTJ. But man, not Bloomburrow, excuse me.
Doomborough.
Yeah, Duskmourn at the end of the year, I think, is the objectively best retail set of the year, and it is like it was cooking. Like I'm just gonna
great
put it that way.
format,
And it's not just because the 2-mana colorless artifact was the best card in the format.
Oh, get the fuck out of here! You notice that card's not even on the list here to talk about. Just to fill in the listener, I'm not a Glimmerlight believer, and no amount of data you throw in my face is going to make me a Glimmerlight believer. So.
I'm a Glimmerlight believer, but I don't care about the data. I just vibe with that card. It was so good.
But when you have to prove your point, you're more than happy to quote the data because. Of course I am. Yeah. Okay.
If it furthers my point, the data is amazing and very useful. If it says something that I don't agree with, the data is useless. And the
data is useless. Set mechanics, a lot of really good mechanics in this set. So we had room enchantments. Chris, you're not a fan of these, right? You don't care too much for them.
No. I ended up like coming around on battles eventually, which I didn't think I was gonna do, mostly because there's like not a lot of them, and the ones that we chose I actually kind of do like mechanically. But I don't know. This is not a new card type that I'm a fan of from a design perspective. I think the art is kind of busy and hideous, and in addition to that, like it's so specific that they're not really going to be able to iterate on it much. So I just kind of decided, like from jump, I was like, I just don't really care about these cards. I just generally don't like cards that have this much going on the card. They're just like painful for me to look at.
I bet one of these could have been the Chains of Mephistopheles card. I'd have to look back at the rooms, but
maybe.
Get to that later. I think rooms were actually kind of cool, and I've mentioned on the podcast before, especially with like class enchantments and sagas and stuff, I'm just a sucker for anything that plays with the card frame, so I think I'm just gonna always like something like this more. Plus, playing the retail limited format more, like rooms were really, really good in the set, so they ended up playing out well. They kind of held a lot of the themes together and stuff like that. And we'll talk about it in the Peasant Cube. This is highly contributing to like that objectification, like increased object creation in Magic, which plays around with a lot of different aspects of recent card design. So
Skyfisher stock has never been higher.
Yeah. I was like, how do we weave Skyfisher in here? Manifest Dread was, I think, just like a huge improvement over original Manifest, and also just a great mechanic. Like the improvement between regular Manifest, which just puts a creature into play as a 2/2, and Manifest Dread, which lets you choose between two cards and mills the other card, like you get card selection. Just means that you actually get to flip up a creature more often, which is like the hope with Manifest, but also like makes it a more synergistic mechanic where you're actually filling up the graveyard a little bit while you do it. So I thought Manifest Dread was a huge win by just repurposing a mechanic that already existed. Eerie, a little bit less so. Eerie was just Constellation that also triggered when you unlocked another room, so nothing super special there. Delirium came back. I'm a huge Delirium lover. I like mechanics that make you start thinking about different aspects of the cards that you're drafting, like the card types or the creature types. So big win for Delirium making a return, and played very synergistically with Manifest Dread. Survival was basically the dud of the set. This was the mechanic that cared about your creature being tapped at the beginning of your second main phase, but wasn't supported enough to really make it work. And the payoffs weren't that great either. So Survival was really the only dud of the set. And then we also got the Impending mechanic, which I think we all agreed was just super underused. It only appeared on the Overlords as kind of like this tweak on Suspend, where the permanent sat in play. It just wasn't a creature for a little while. So I would have liked to see more Impending in the set on lower rarity cards, but I do think the Overlords, for the most part, are pretty cool, if not just like super powerful. So a lot of awesome mechanics, plus Eerie Survival being like a little bit lower on the tier. So any thoughts on mechanics before we talk about specific cards? Because Duskmourn has a lot of very powerful things worth talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this set was just loaded with the mechanics, and honestly, most of them worked in the retail set, which, looking at the last couple of mechanics listings, like most of the other mechanics in those sets didn't work, and I think that contributed to Duskmourn feeling like such a cohesive set, is that almost all the mechanics worked. Like, obviously Survival really didn't, but I think everything else, like Delirium, Eerie, Manifest Dread, Rooms, these were all major pillars of the format, which is a rarity in a limited set.
Someone wrote in a note here that this feels like Modern Horizons Light, and I agree that this is probably the most like blatantly powerful set of the year behind Modern Horizons in terms of like individual cards that have either caused problems or like top tier, mostly in creature threats, right? Like one of the ones we're still playing is Screaming Nemesis, which is the 3-mana 3/3 haste that rebounds any damage dealt to it, and then if that ability triggers and hits your opponent, they can't gain life for the rest of the turn. Just a blister and fast like red 3-drop that usually gets the hit in and then like forces your opponent into some really bad situations. And where we really have seen this pop off that I don't think any of us really speculated on too much was in red green, where you could combine it with fight spells like Primal Might and force your opponent to deal damage to it, killing off multiple creatures or like nugging them for the last little bit of damage. So this has been a very impressive 3-drop in red. I would say this is like almost certainly better than like Breaches. I think this is, I have to look at the list. This might be red's best 3-drop right now, specifically for aggressive decks. At least that's how I feel about it.
It is very powerful.
It's big Gruul gaming energy.
Yeah, do you think it's just a Gruul card, like Gruul / mono red? I guess it's a little bit worse than like Izzet.
No, I think it's amazing in general, but I just think it's really maximized if you're playing Gruul, because you get the fight spells and the pump spells and all that. But like, you can put this in basically any aggressive deck. It's just, it gets better the more ways you have to forcibly make your opponent rectify with the fact that it has this effect on it, right?
Or so if torch the witness.
Pumping the stats or like forcing through damage with fight spells, things like that, just make it better.
Yeah, I just think I think that this card is so good that if you want to ever attack, then you should just play it. The thing that I think gets overlooked about it when people discuss it is, if you're behind, this is just like a 3/3 blocker that can trade for something and like kill another creature in the bargain. Like, this is hard to attack into as well.
Trade for 2 3/3s, yeah.
Yeah, trade for 2/3/3s. If you have it on defense and your opponent has a bunch of like really small creatures, like 2 power creatures, like they're never gonna like chump attack into it because you can just eat 2 creatures. It's just yeah, the card's like silly. I could see it eventually being like a people don't want to play with it anymore type card. Ironically, it's really good against red. It's really good against red because like God forbid you remove it by burning it, you're just 2 for 1ing yourself. So
What went wrong with Overlord of the Mistmoors?
that it's an unfair design.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out most of the time you're just supposed to cast this for 4 mana, make 2/2/1s, and that's like that alone is just good enough to pressure your opponent. And then you've got this gigantic Grave Titan-esque threat just looming in the background. But also, you can be sitting there in a close game. You know, you're winning. And then your opponent survives the 7 mana. They slam it. We were talking about cards that were like big, goofy control finishers that take over the game. And this card was very, very silly. The handful of times we saw it, it was basically, everybody always said, hey, it's the best card in my deck.
Okay, so Overlord of the Mistmoors is 5 white for a 6/6. It has Impending 4 for 2 white, which is kind of what it sounds like. You play it out, and then a certain number of turns pass, and then it goes from being an enchantment that just has this effect to like actually being the creature. And then when it enters or attacks, you create 2 1/1 white instant creature tokens with flying. So for 4 mana, it's just 2/1 flyers just up front, which is not like a card you would play, but is honestly not a bad deal, like at all. And then yeah, if you just survive for a little while longer, you get a 6/6 that just repeatedly does this. It's really, really silly. It's a really silly card.
We ended up cutting Felia to play this because of the blink interaction too, which is not something I think we could do in our cube. Maybe there was like one niche interaction where you could like reanimate it or blink it or whatever, but if you can Impending one of these Overlords and then blink the enchantment, it just comes back into play as a creature. You get the ETB and then it can start attacking, which is just super unreasonable. So we actually had to cut Felia, which is probably for the best too, because MH3 card, you know. Enduring Curiosity, that's the blue cat that comes in, and it's a 4/3 for 4. If you hit your opponent with a creature, you draw a card. When it dies, it comes back into play as a non-creature enchantment. From what I understand, this is like a top tier card in Standard right now, and I totally get that. Like the stats on this for a blue creature on top of what it does just seems like super push to me.
Yeah, this card just is really, really fantastic in Standard at the moment, and honestly, it's played really well when I've seen it. A lot of times, I think the most common play pattern with it is you flash it in on 4 and you block something, or you flash it in on your opponent's turn and block something, and then you like untap and you start pecking your opponent and getting some card advantage. Sometimes you just flash it in the instep as one of those ways of punishing opponents who are trying to get real clever with playing around counter magic. And it just allows you to start generating real advantage in what we've talked about playing these cheap, evasive flyer creatures in blue. It really lets you leverage that, right? It lets you start converting that into more and more advantage over time.
And it really shows off Blue's ability to be a proactive deck sometimes too. Like this is a 4-mana 4/3. Like you curve your 2-drop Malcolm into like Sphalen into this, like you're the beatdown and you're drawing cards while being the beatdown. So plus you don't care what happens to this card, right? It obviously it can get exiled every now and then, but we don't play a ton of exile removal. So if it trades off in combat, you're happy. If it bites a removal spell, you're usually pretty happy. Like the Mass Curiosity Coastal Piracy effect is strong, but you would never use a cube slot on a card that does just that. So staple on like a completely reasonable body on a flash creature on a blue card, that all adds up to like just an excellent card. Other super powerful cards, we're still on Oculus, Abhorrent Oculus, the 3-mana 5/5 Manifest Dread on your opponent's upkeep, but you have to exile 6 cards in order to cast it. I think this is probably close to the chop and block in terms of like player complaints, but we haven't cut it yet, and I'm actually fine with this one because there is a little bit of a mini game you have to play to get to the card as far as getting the 6 cards in your graveyard. Plus it competes with a couple of the other graveyard centric cards like Dig Through Time and Torrential Gearhulk and stuff like that, so you have to kind of pick your battles there. But the card is super powerful, plus you can unearth it sometimes, which apparently has happened and has not been fun for the people who played against that. So
Yeah, card's good. I know the complaining about it is mostly centered around the fact that when it's good, it's very oppressive feeling because it's just such a cheap threat that requires an answer. And then the opposite side of that is there's some percentage of the time where it's just stuck in your hand. But I kind of like the card, so I'm hesitant to cut it, even though I think on a pure power level, it's probably a little strong. I do like that it's one of those cards that requires a little work out of you to get the power.
Yeah, and that's why I'm okay with it, is you don't just get to free roll this on turn 3. What does happen with it is you usually end up playing it on, like, turn 5 or 6, but at that point you're also on a counter spell when you can cast it, so it feels really tough to try and beat it at that point. Even though, I mean, it's a 3-drop that doesn't come down on turn 3, but we've seen that with delve spells, right? Like, this is essentially a delve spell, but it does lock up a game for the most part if you can back it up with a counter spell. Valgavol's Onslaught, which we actually just axed too. That's another card from this set that I think we were all generally excited about this one when we reviewed it not too long ago, and then it turns out like 5 mana for 2 4/4s is pretty strong. And then it scales up from there and scales back down to a 3-drop if you needed to be a 3-drop as well. So
it kind of hit the fears that we had on that card where, you know, on 3 it's not good, but it's like sometimes passable. And then on 5 it's about as the best thing you can be doing in the color, and on 7 it's probably as good or better than playing a Titan of Industry, which seems kind of unreasonable to have a card that's better than your dedicated 7-drop on turn 7.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the very first time we put this in this cube, I watched Chris play against Melody, who cast a Valgavol's Onslaught. I don't remember how much for, but next turn they flipped up a White of the Reliquary, which was like a 10/10 at the time or something like that. It was,
yeah,
it was pretty ridiculous.
I forgot about that, but yes, that was wild.
Yeah, I watched somebody flip up a Croxa too, which is insane.
Oh, that is really nuts.
Yeah, you just get to bypass the whole escape thing and start attacking. Teld, you had a couple pieces of equipment here that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, so I like the name for dissection tools being Bad Skull, like worse skull.
Worse skull.
Yeah, I mean, this card has played out, I think, quite well. It's got kind of the scammy sort of feel with Stoneforge Mystic some of the time, which is a little annoying. But on the flip side, the equip cost in most decks is pretty significant. You have to sacrifice. I'm sorry. Let me start. Dissection tools is 5 mana for an equipment that manifests dread when it ETBs. And it gives +2/+2 Death Touch and Lifelink, and you can re-equip it by sacrificing a different creature. So this card, just generally speaking, is a pretty good 5 mana play. But in most of your decks, it's not free to move it around. You might be able to do it once or twice, but it does have a significant cost. But it's the best colorless card we've gotten in quite a while, outside of Smuggler's Copter being, I think, the only other good one we've gotten in recent memory. And so it's fitting a pretty interesting spot. And then the other one that I think is a lot more fun and interesting card is Chainsaw, which I didn't think I would say about the card because it reads kind of boring. But so Chainsaw is 1 in a red for a equipment artifact that ETBs, deals 3 to a creature, and then you can pay 3 mana and equip it. And every time a creature dies while Chainsaw is on the board, it gets a rev counter, and you get +1/+0 for every rev counter. So basically, you play it, you kill something, and then as the game goes on, it starts scaling up. And Chainsaw has this really powerful effect of being able to turn all of your random tokens eventually into major threats just by playing the game. It really maximizes itself in the sort of red-black or Mardu sack space, or in like Boros. But it's just a generally good card that plays out really well. It's a 2-dribble removal spell for your Stoneforge Mystic that also plays really well in a long game where you're able to, if you're playing an attrition game, this really maximizes how much power and value you're able to eke out of every single card you play.
Mm-hmm. And it was these 2 cards that really made Stoneforge Mystic viable, right? Because Stoneforge Mystic's still kind of on the cute side, but I think the fact that we have Cryptic Coat as a threat, Dissection Tools as a threat, but also Chainsaw, and I think we added Assimilation Aegis from OTJ as removal spells, gives Stoneforge Mystic like an actual toolbox of effects that you can fetch up, which is what the card needs to do to justify its spot in the cube.
Yeah, I think at the current moment, Stoneforge Mystic is just a great card. I don't think it's. I mean, you have to do some building with it. So like, you kind of have to spec on the equipment a little bit early sometimes. But I think it's just a fantastic card. It's got the toolbox effect. It's a good value card on 2. Plays well in both aggressive and controlling strategies, depending on what you're doing. So yeah, just overall, I love Stoneforge Mystic, and I think we're finally at a point where it is a very good cube card. It won't be an every draft kind of card, but if you're able to bypass the hoops of getting like, one piece of equipment, you might run it depending on what your deck looks like. 2 pieces, it becomes very, very good. And after that, it's just all gravy.
I think we've got somewhere around 7 to 9 last I checked. We've got the new Celestial Armor, we've got Bone Splitter, Embercleave. So there's a lot of things that can pick up now. I don't know if I'm there on it's a great card, but it does feel like Spirited Companion that draws you Embercleave sometimes. So
it is Teld's official position.
Yeah, I know Chris is very hesitant over the Stoneforge Mystic.
No.
I
will probably never draft it and put it in my deck, just because of implicit, like, the biases that I have. But I will say that if it is going to be in the cube, in its current state, it is doing what I would want it to be doing in the cube. As we've discussed elsewhere, like, I'm not interested in seeing this ever become a combo card. But yeah, that's not what it is. It's kind of like a demonic tutor for a couple of different equipment effects, and we have enough equipment effects that do different things or work in like different spots. I think but you guys kind of covered this already. The fact that it can tutor up like a protection spell or a removal piece, or just like what it's nice. It's a nice little package card.
I do think pairing it with blue gives you the overall best bang for your buck, because I think Cryptic Coat is the most powerful card on average that you can get with Stoneforge Mystic, just because it lets you curve into it, and then it gives you such a good thing to do with your mana later into the game. So I think if you get Cryptic Coat, that's really when it goes off. But yeah, I think I've drafted this last 3 times we drafted the cube. I think I've drafted a Stoneforge deck twice, and it was just one of the best cards in my deck.
That's fun. It's a fun build around to have around, and it will make us evaluate playable equipment a little bit higher from new set releases. So one other card I almost missed here from the special guests is Damnation. We got Damnation from the set, which I think completed the kind of like trifecta of black sweepers that we got all back to back to back, and revamped the way black sweepers looked from the beginning of the year. I bet if, Chris, you look back at the beginning of the year cube, we're on Languish, Extinction Events, Crux of Fate, maybe. And we even got Devious Cover Up in MKM, which felt like an improvement over Crux of Fate. But now we're on Toxic Deluge from MH3, Season of Lost from Bloomburrow, and Damnation from Duskmorn, which, we're thumbs up on Black Sweepers now. There's no, like, if they want to give us anything better moving forward, go for it, but we're in a happy place with those.
We are, and it's really, really nice, because for the longest time, one of the glaring discrepancies between like the blue-white and the blue-black control decks was that White's Wraths were just like the archetypal 4-mana clear the board, or in the case of Sunfall, which we no longer play, way better than that. And like for the longest time we were playing a sweeper that a guy literally lost a game to me that he shouldn't have because he accidentally clicked destroy all dragon creatures and there were no dragons. So yeah, I couldn't be happier about that gap being closed. And if at a larger size, or if we ever wanted to go up more black sweepers or whatever, not saying that we would, we even have Languish and Meathook Massacre in the tank that we're not even playing. So we're good on Black Wraths now.
It's funny that it all happened over the course of the last 6 months, right? Those 3 sweepers all came from MH3 forward, and we were playing Languish and Crux of Fate since we started the cube.
Yeah.
Like, there was no budging on black sweepers for the most part until Devious Cover Up, which isn't even, like, a super impressive one.
No. I mean, literally, like, I think all the extra text on that card didn't even really matter, like, at all. I was just like, oh, we have an opportunity to play an equally bad card that you can't accidentally fuck up by misclicking, so we're just going to play that one instead.
Yeah, I have to be fair to Meathook. Meathook was in between those, but Meathook's obviously, like, super insane for a black sweeper.
Yeah, Meathook's a card that we finally, maybe I should have done a little bit more research, like cards we finally cut to power this year, but I think Meathook is one we eventually got rid of just because player sentiment was like, please, we don't want to play against this anymore.
Yeah, I think the players were right about that one. I think it was Black's best card.
I think it was kind of obviously, like, the reason it's so good is it's more flexible than just this deck, but I do think that was kind of like a direct nerf to some of the black sacrifice decks in which it was easily the best card, but it did have to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that card was just extremely frustrating to play against, and the sentiment like built up over time until it was just like basically you had multiple people just begging every time it resolved, just please cut this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on Duskmorn here?
Yeah, great set, fantastic set. It was still wonky on the flavor, but man, this set was so good to draft. The objective side of me, the spiky side of me, is just like, yeah, this set ruled.
I agree. I think this was probably, which OTJ, I agree. I think we lined up our sets pretty well. I liked MH3 a lot, but OTJ and Duskmorn were like big hits, like possibly both top fives for me. I'll come back to that in a year. Ask me how I feel about Duskmorn, but the last two sets, I don't know that we have to spend too much time on them because we talked about them very recently. Like these both came out within the last month and a half or so. And also, they didn't give us too much in general. So I guess let's lump these two together as Foundations and Pioneer Masters, which came out in November and December, respectively. I'll go into a little bit of detail for people who may be listening to this not directly after our set reviews for those, like maybe coming back to this episode in the future. But Foundations came out in November, and it was basically a return to core set with the idea that it was going to set a backbone for Standard for the next 5 years. So every card in Foundations will be legal in Standard until 2029. And it basically had a bunch of like really small return in mechanics like Flashback, Prowess, and Raid. It's a core set though. So like as far as Cube goes, there are some generically fine playable cards, but nothing that's really pushing the envelope in terms of power, which is okay. This is very much a not for us set, right? Where it's like, this is meant for newer players. This is meant to have some commander stuff in it. This is meant to get new people into the game and have a very bare bones experience. And that's exactly how it's played out. And then of course, Pioneer Masters being an arena only set that's meant to get cards onto the client for the Pioneer/Explorer formats. Again, very much a not for us thing. It gave us a bunch of cards, like there's 300, 350, 400 cards in the set, but given the timeline that those cards span, there's not a lot of really powerful stuff by comparison to stuff we have today. So Chris actually mentioned in the last episode, it's a lot like, it was a good analogy. You said something like, it's like you need a part for a car, and they call you 3 years later to tell you got the part, but
you don't drive.
But
you
already bought a new car. So
yeah. I'll call the guy I sold it to. He can finally drive it. Yeah, that is what it felt like. I mean, there's not really much that I can add to that other than like you would think that the 1-2 punch of like a Foundation style set and then a Pioneer Master set would both be kind of like slam dunks for getting more cube stuff onto Arena, but they had already power crept a lot of it or given us it. In Foundations, I understand why they like didn't give us like the really powerful old cantrips or whatever, but it was really funny when they just like reprinted Opt for the millionth time. We have like 15 versions of Opt, and we have like Ponder and Preordain both coded onto the client. We can't play with either one of them. Not that Blue is like currently in distress or whatever, but Blue's kind of an interesting spot because there are no cards that I'm like, man, Blue would be so much more competitive in our cube if we had X. Like they've kind of, our FBI agent has been like making it rain on us, like we're working like the magic stick in Atlanta for like blue stuff. We've been asking for better statted creatures, better value creatures, card advantage stuff that impacts the board, yada, yada, yada. We've even, we didn't really talk about 3 steps ahead that much, but again, FBI agent, like seriously, Wizards give us jobs. One of the things we talked about was if they're not going to push the efficiency of counter spells, then like some modality would be really nice. And now we have several modal counter spells that are pretty good. But the reason I'm saying all this is like Blue doesn't like need any upgrades right now in terms of its positioning in our meta, but it has the most like bread and butter historical cards that are like in every single cube list that we don't have, and the two best cantrips are the ones that stick out the most to me.
I was just going to say that I think it was notable because I think Blue has come full circle in a way where when we talked about Blue in the Blues Got the Blues episode, we mentioned how important cantrips were. And then I think over the year, we got a bunch of powerful blueprints and shifted away from cantrips being super important to Blue's identity. Mm-hmm. But then some more recent prints and recent discussions around the efficiency of cards and things like that has pushed a lot of the best blue cards or cards that blue really wants to be playing, they need those cantrips to fuel them. Like, if you're putting Ledger Shredder in your deck without a bunch of blue cantrips, the card's very bad. If you're putting a Board Oculus in your deck without a bunch of cantrips, it's much worse. So there's just a number of very decent blue cards that kind of lean on those cantrips. So not getting a new one it wasn't that they reprinted Opt for the 15th time. It was we didn't get anything, right? And it happened to be Opt. It didn't have to be Ponder or Preordain, but it would have been nice to get some new ground in that regard, like Serum Visions, for example.
We didn't get a cantrip this year, did we?
I don't think we did.
The last one we added was Sleight of Hand from Wilds of Eldraine last year. So yeah, I don't think we got a generic one. I'm sure there are ones that like target creatures and stuff like that, but we got Quicken. Yeah, so not too much to say about these sets. For Foundations, notable cards that have been pointed out are Celestial Armor as like the pseudo protection / Voltron equipment that gives a creature fly-in +2/+0 and saves it from a removal spell the turn it enters. And then there's also Sear Slicer Goblin as the 2-mana 2/1 that pumps out a 1/1 on each end step. Rabble Master is a good shout too.
Rabble Man's funny because like we completely missed that they gave it to us. So...
Yep, and then it's also in Pioneer Masters. It's in both sets.
Oh, is it really? Wow, that's funny.
Yeah.
Like they've been waiting this. Yeah, it's like, hey, sorry, I forgot your birthday for the last 5 years. Here's like 2 things that I got you that are the exact same thing.
Yeah, two people got you the same gift.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, it was kind of funny. There were 2 cards from Foundations. Well, there was Rabble Man. I didn't realize that we got it, and then I can't remember who pointed it out, but I was like, oh, okay. Well, that definitely is something we should have added. And then another card in our Foundations review that we completely missed that like I spotted later for some, I can't remember where I saw it, but there's this Quilled Great Worm card. Quilled Great Worm is 6 mana for a 7/7 trample. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. Oh, that's interesting. I kind of shortcutted to a player, but it's just if it gets into combat at all, that's actually much better. And then you may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control in addition to paying its costs. So like this is totally a Baneslayer, but it's one of those like kind of in my mind sort of pseudo Baneslayer because if assuming your opponent is not holding up instant speed interaction, which they're not always doing that, right? Sometimes they're tapped out, sometimes they don't have a Doomblade or whatever. If you play this and you have largest creatures on board that can swing, like this is going to become a huge problem for your opponent really quick. And then if even like a mid-sized creature gets in for damage and they remove this creature afterwards, you might have enough counters lying around to recast it. So I'm excited about this card, not because I think it's like the world's most insane or novel design. It's that our green 6-drop options for the longest times have either been really, really medium, really, really do not ever put that in my cube insane, or just like really good against stuff that green is already really good against. So I don't know if it's like an OCD thing or what it is, but I have just like wanted a second green 6-drop that just does not tick any of the boxes of like OP, terrible, or bad meta fit, and I think this might be it.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of this Foundation stuff, especially the Great Worm, because we didn't add it right away, is so it's new enough that we don't have like a lot of feedback on how it's actually performed. So like this and Pioneer Master stuff, like JVP was a big question mark for our review. It's like, are these going to be good? We can't give you a recommendation on something like Quilled Slagworm yet because we just added it to our cube.
I don't think JVP is going to last.
We shall see. We shall see. I will say Foundations like is maybe my least favorite limited format of all time. Like I think it's absolutely fucking trash. But again, it's not for me. It's for people who are trying to learn the game. So I'm not going to hold it. I am going to hold it against it. I think it's a terrible limited format. Pioneer Masters has been really cool, but also it's been out for 6 days as of the recording of this video. So it's hard to say too much else about it. So if you're listening to this episode in the future, sorry we don't have much else to say about Foundations, Pioneer Masters, but they're just really, really fresh for us at this time. So plus we just did a Pioneer Masters review like 2 weeks ago for our last episode. So go listen to that if you want to hear more opinions about cards that don't really hold up in 2024, 2025 Magic sets. That's it for the year. There was no in-between stuff like anthologies and stuff, but did want to look at some big picture stuff from our cube perspective. Maybe some of this applies to like cube as a whole, but for our perspective, we've talked about some of this throughout. Like we don't really have to talk about the Black Sweepers again because we already talked about them, but one thing I wanted to expand on was revamping the red removal, right?
Yeah. I'd like to talk about this one if I can. When
Yeah,
you're done.
go ahead and just take it, because I think you're going to say a lot of what I was going to say, but also some extra stuff.
Okay, so the reason I want to take this, and correct me if I'm having like amnesia or I'm blowing smoke up my own ass, but I feel like I was the person who started thinking about this initially and kind of pushing us in this direction, but I could be misremembering that and just giving myself credit for something that I didn't actually do.
Blow smoke up your ass. That's fine.
So as we got progressively more prowess creatures and the sort of damage values, initially we were really like focused on like, well, every single red spell that does damage to anything we want to be able to go face, right? Because there's sort of this historical like, oh, well, you combine like fast creatures and face burn to get your opponent dead as quickly as possible. But what we kind of noticed was like reds getting bricked on board, and then you just don't have enough face burn to kill your opponent if they gain even like a single life. Not to mention the fact that, and I sort of eventually think we figured this out, is the values on face burn were not going up, but creatures in general are getting bigger. So the idea that like face burn doubles as removal and face burn was just becoming progressively less true. And this like 4 toughness break point became very evident, was hugely problematic for red, because like every lightning strike variant does like 3 damage. And I just kind of started to think like, okay, well, wouldn't it be a better way to get your opponent dead if your like early prowess creatures could just keep getting through while you were removing your opponent's stuff? And it turns out like, yeah, actually, yes. I will take Obliterating Bolt over Lightning Strike like every single day of the week now, because if your red removal spells can actually remove creatures in this world of larger creatures and they're pumping your prowess dudes, then they are removing stuff and doing damage at the same time, like effectively. So we're playing a lot more 1 mana deal 3s that don't go face, they just efficiently deal with blockers, and 2 mana deal 4s. And then in the case of Scorching Shot, they printed a red deal 5, which for mono red is like a really big get because that removes a lot of stuff. So yeah, if you're feeling like your red aggressive decks are getting bricked a lot faster than they used to be, maybe consider shifting your burn suite over to stuff that only targets creatures but does more damage for the mana, and you might actually find that your red aggressive decks start to perform better. It was like a light and day difference for us.
Yeah, and I mean, we still play 1 or 2 Lightning Strike variants. I think we're on like Incendiary Flow, maybe actual Lightning Strike, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're still on Lightning Strike.
Chainsaw is clearly like Lightning Strike Plus, but I agree wholeheartedly. I think it has been a great change to shift the removal away from inefficient face burn towards efficient creature removal. And like, I could say that that's part of our design specifically, but also like stat lines. We spent entire episodes talking about stat lines this year. That's just going up across the board. That's not just like, oh, cards were added into our cube. It's just how they design cards now. So we saw at the beginning of this year, we had this, you said the 4 toughness breakpoint. We began the year with cards like Preacher of the Schism, Sentinel of the Nameless City, Svalin. Eventually we got cards like 6 from MH3, which we're not playing anymore for reasons we've already mentioned. Like, it was like, oh, everything on 3 has 4 toughness. Like, everything survives Lightning Strike. So my lightning, either I have to 2-for-1 myself to kill your 4 toughness creature in red, or I have to hope that somehow I get you to 3 life and the lightning strike actually kills you, because a lightning strike for 3 to the face doesn't matter if you don't win the game with burn. So yeah, we took that shift towards, let's just make the removal against creatures super efficient, which as a byproduct of that, you'll be able to push more damage with your creatures, which is what you wanted to do with that face burn anyway. So
correct. Yeah.
I can't say if I can credit this towards you or Teld or whoever. It wasn't me. I'm not taking credit for this, but it was a good shift, and the removal has been good, and especially something like Torch the Witness, which has the potential to just be a 2-for-1 anyway. So
yeah, Torch the Witness is a cool card. For those of you that don't know what it is red and X, and it deals twice X damage to target creature. So on 2 mana, it only deals with 2 toughness stuff, but then on 3 mana, it deals with 4 toughness stuff, etc., etc. And if you deal excess damage with it, you investigate, which is pretty nice. So yeah.
It is good for, I think it's healthy too, for a red deck to have an opponent who can resolve something like a Titan of Industry and not just be brick walled, period. Like a card like Torch the Witness, it is expensive, but it can, it's like a check and balance, right? Torch the Witness is a card that can deal with the biggest creatures in the cube, which is something that, it's a nice tool for red decks to have, to be able to get over that hump so that they're not just dead when something like that resolves.
Yep, exactly.
Absolutely,
Witchstalker Frenzy, also super awesome card.
Oh yeah, yeah. That one was a Teld shout, and that might have been
that was definitely a Teld shout.
That was Wilds of Eldraine from last year, and that might have been the one that actually started pushing us in the direction of like, oh, super efficient removal lets you attack better.
No, I think you're right. I think Teld advocating for Witchstalker Frenzy and me seeing that card perform is what kind of made me start thinking like maybe we need more effects like this.
Every now and then I'm like, should we really keep Teld around? And then like he does something, and I'm like, man, maybe we should keep him on for another year. Sign the contract.
Necessary evil.
Yeah.
I remember my first experience casting Witchstalker Frenzy was I was playing like a Gruul deck, and I cast a Questing Beast. I attacked my opponent. I was pretty far behind. And this was also the moment I realized Tyvar's Stand was busted, because they went to their turn. They like tapped out for a big thing, and then they shipped all their creatures, with like a haste creature or whatever. I Witchstalker Frenzied, blocked Tyvar's Stand, their removal spell, traded for like 3 creatures. It was just like one of those turns where it's like, oh, these cards are just like, turns out 1 mana cards that do a bunch of mana worth of things, really good.
Yeah, it turns out.
Another big picture thing here I wanted to chat about, because it still comes up in it's actually kind of a controversial thing we did, was the mana fixing situation, which we mentioned briefly. This really shifted around when we got the Surveil lands at the beginning of the year, but we got the rest of the fetches, so we have a full cycle of 10 fetches. We got Prismatic Vista as a special guest card in OTJ, so we basically upped our fetch count to 10. We have all the fetch lands plus Prismatic Vista plus Fabled Passage, but we added the Surveil lands and cut the Triomes, which simultaneously made the mana fixing better because of the 10 fetches, but also the ease of mana fixing was reduced by getting rid of the Triumph. So I don't know how much you guys want to talk to like why we did that and the effect that it's had, but I think the baseline is like it felt like mana fixing was too free. And like there was a more incentive than ever to just do good stuff pile, which was effective too. And I'm not opposed to like good stuff piles being effective, but when that is an effective deck in a format, I do want the person who is drafting it to have to like make concessions for their mana fixing a little bit.
Yeah, when we had all of the Triomes and everything, there was definitely a spate there, and it might have been like partially motivated by the fact that Persian, shout out to Persian Magic, our newest admin, was on a hot streak, and he really likes to play value decks that paint with all the colors of the wind. But I think we realized that if it was already pretty simple to do it with all the Triomes and all the dual lands we were playing, that once we got fetches, it was just going to be even more ridiculously trivial. And this is definitely like an OCD thing, but one of the things when I was theorizing about this that I really didn't like was the idea that I could play like, and I realize this is like an edge case, but hear me out because I'm insane. I could take like the Jund Triome, right, as like a dual land in my like red-black deck, and then take like basically strictly red-black deck, and then take fetch lands that were completely off both of my actual colors that could both go fetch it. Like, there's just something about that I really fucking hated. Like, I was like, if I see someone crack, like, a Simic fetch to go get Zeotora's Triome in their strictly red-black deck, I'm gonna shit a brick. Like, not that anybody would ever do that, but, like, I saw it in my mind's eye, and I was like, this is a perversion of nature. So I think the compromise that we made was good. The fixing's still really good.
I think fetches are still just almost exclusively the best pack one pick ones you can make in the cube. That being said, I think they were even better. Like the combination of LTR land cyclers, triomes, and fetches just made your mana situation trivial. We were talking about how we didn't think you could do like double pips of everything, and then I remember Drix 3-0'd our cube with a deck that he very specifically drafted to troll us, where it had like double splashed of every single color in the cube. Basically, it was like red, black, white cards in his base blue deck or something, and it was just completely egregious, but he just drafted a bunch of Triomes and fetch lands and LTR land cyclers and was just like, yeah, the mana is free.
And that's one of our biggest complaints right now, I think, is people regularly say they wish the Triomes were still here.
They're not.
And I think we stand by. I mean, I stand by the decision. I think the mana fixin' is still good, but you have to actually take it over other playables sometimes, rather than just floating it to like pick 10 or 11 or whatever.
Yeah, I don't see anybody struggling to play 3 colors and splash a 4th right now. It just I don't see anybody having a hard time with that.
Yeah, I mean to put a bow on that too, Tim. Like in one of my most recent drafts, I first picked a Misty Rainforest out of a mid pack. Like there were some good cards, but nothing. I just like, all right, I'll take the fixing, and then I took a Temple Garden over some other good cards, and was like, okay, well now I can just kind of play anything in the Bant spectrum. And I ended up actually drafting a Bant deck, but like my idea was that if I end up in blue white control, I would have good mana, and if I ended up in a green spectrum deck, I'd have good mana, and I think you still have to give up good cards to do that. I think one of the advantages and disadvantages of the power creep in Magic is that I think the fixing situation is such that like there's fewer true power outliers in our cube. And so you can, if you're the kind of drafter who likes to play very conservatively and very like consistently, you can just draft fetches and like mana based cards early into the cube and then kind of see what's open. And if you can play if you've got the mana to play like 3 colors, one of them is probably going to be open enough that you can kind of move into that lane and you can kind of just see what your deck's supposed to look like. So I think the power level rising of the cards increases the reward for being patient and practical about your mana situation. And I think it results in the cube kind of being what I would call like a 2.25 color format, where I think 2 and a splash is probably our most common drafted deck at the moment. You can play full 3 color if you really get good mana. You can play solid mono with a splash or mono color, 2 color decks. But I think 2 and a splash, like for like 1 or 2 cards, is the most common configuration we've seen at the moment.
Mm-hmm. How did you pull a Misty Rainforest out of a mid pack? Misty Rainforest wasn't in Midnight Hunt.
Oh God, go away.
Okay. Anyway,
right, thank you.
One more kind of big picture change I wanted to mention that came up in a few episodes was the Savannah Lions discourse, and how 1 mana 2/1 with upside is something that we've moved away from as like a quintessential aggro card. We still play a couple of them. The ones that have upside, we're not quite on playing Ragavan and hopefully never will be, but I think Teld and I were initially of the opinion that these cards were dropping off significantly. I fully believe, Chris, you've come around to this, that like unless they're doing something significant beyond just having 2/1 stat line for 1, it's pretty clear that the Savannah Lions stat line is not holding up these days, and we need them to either push that moving forward or find an alternative to the 1-drop aggro decks. And I think what we've landed on is like, as long as the aggro decks are doing something that affects the board on turn 1, like it's usually enough. And you would rather have kind of like the late game security of like a Thraben Inspector or something like that instead of a 2/1 that's essentially doing nothing.
Yeah, the biggest advantage is just having the 1-drop in play so that you can play a turn 2 Luminarch Aspirate, or you can play a turn 2, whatever that will scale up into the game.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or still being able to double spell like on turn 3 with a 1-drop and a 2-drop.
Right. Yeah, it's I think it's variable by color. So what's been nice in white as far as like, and we still have like a couple of Savannah Lions type cards. But one thing that we realized was in white, like white these days, at least in our cube, and I think if you want to play these cards, there's a bevy of them available. There are a lot of ways in white to make your small creatures bigger. So having like a 1/2 in your deck that investigates and then will be buffed to like a 2/3 or even a 3/4 with like counters or anthems or something is just better than playing Savannah Lions a big percentage of the time, right? The value is that it is a body that can then be grown and provided some value. In red, you've got the prowessy guys, which synergizes really well with that game plan. And there's also this Hired Claw card, which is cool, which you can invest mana into and grow. Yeah, just raw Savannah Lions, and it took me a really long time to give up on this until really had to like wail on me, and he was right the entire time. I think the easiest explanation for why just straight up Savannah Lions aren't particularly good aggressive 1-drops just on their own in a vacuum anymore is 2 mana and 3 mana cards have just been getting progressively beefier. Like how many 2 mana 2/3s have they printed in the last few years? And Savannah Lions aren't getting any bigger. So when the fast follow-up plays are getting bigger and the Savannah Lions aren't, they just become irrelevant a lot faster. They've got to do more.
Yeah, and more free 1/1 tokens attached to things on things like Mischievous Mystic and Seer Slicer Goblin, stuff like that just means like more things that can incidentally block Savannah Lions. So a tragedy of rectangle theory, as it were. We'll see. I have a sneaking suspicion that the Kellen that they printed from Foundations is a sign that they are aware
Right.
Whether that card pans out or not, it's a sign that they're aware that these Savannah lines need to be pushed in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. Somebody wanted to mention real quick the potential for like the green-white +1/+1 counters proliferation going on.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw this out there that we, without even intentionally directly supporting it, I think green-white counters synergies is something you have to actually consider when you're drafting. Cards like Bloated Contaminator went from cards that have ribbon text to cards that are very, very scary. Bristly Bill's 5-mana activated ability is terrifying on tons of board states. Mm-hmm. You know, it just turns out that there's so many incidental ways to put +1/+1 counters that anytime we get a card that is fairly playable... Yeah, anytime we get a card that is fairly playable, that has some combination of like proliferate or gives +1 counters, I think we're getting to the point where our green-white section is, outside of Tristani, more driven by that than I would say the tokens thing. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. But I think when you're drafting these really good green and white cards, the stats things, the things that can add stats are really important. And I think the decks that I like to draft that Tempo Shell really want to have these cards in play because it allows you to take your threats and make them even bigger while you're protecting them with your Boggles plays. So, you know, there's a lot of value in them too. Just being able to open up attacks, and it's really pushing that 2 mana, especially because we got Scythe Cat and we got Bristly Bill. We already had Luminarch Aspirant. You know, we've got all these cards now at 2 mana that are just scaling up the game so quickly. Yeah.
Yep. There's that's part of the reason I think this Quilled Slagworm might actually pan out is I could actually see a world where you bring it back from the graveyard. Though I guess if you have 7 counters on board, like you have to weigh whether it's better to just have the extra 7 power and toughness in play. But I can see situations. It's even made me consider Innkeeper's Talent from Bloomburrow as it's basically a Luminarch Aspirant on an enchantment instead of a creature, but it has some extra text, and for 5 mana it doubles all counter production on everything. But I feel like having Luminarch Aspirant not as a creature is probably a rough spot to be in because then you can't kill it.
Yeah, I think the balancing factor on all these cards is that you can just Doomblade them and move on with life.
Yeah, I mean that's some big picture cube changes for the year. I'm sure as soon as we get whatever's coming out next year with all these Universes Beyond stuff, there will be some other big shifts. But for now, that's kind of some big stuff that went on for our cube this year. So I am going to do these little awards real quick, but before I do that, there's a little section that was added here. I don't know if whoever added it here wants to go over it, but there's some text that says, "We were right, suck it." So that feels like something that needs to be said out loud by whoever typed that in.
I think that was probably me. I already did most of it. I mean, all joking aside, you don't have to suck it. That's up to you. But Intrude and Sphinx were the 2 big ones where they just seem to be pretty broadly panned by the community, and I think that they're both just like excellent blue cards.
JDG hits for the year, basically.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely think I missed more this year than hit, but
yeah, I have to throw out my own "suck it, Chris" Stoneforge Mystic and rules. I've already said, I know I've already hinted at that, but yeah, I know you were pretty off of it, but this card rules.
You know what, dude? I'm gonna put Stoneforge Mystic. I'm gonna put Mystic in my next Yawgmoth deck with no pieces of equipment to get with it, just so I can play it as a 2 mana 1/2 to feed to Yawg Dad.
And they complain about how it's bad.
Yeah.
You know what we didn't mention? We mentioned how you willed the Sphinx into being, but we didn't mention the Hopeender Quaddle.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so Hopeender Quaddle was a card from MH3 that also like perfectly fit a design that I had essentially come up with, and they just made the stat line better. It was 3 mana, 2/2 Flash Flyer, so like Flash Windrake that force spikes. And I was really, really thrilled when they made it because it was something I've been looking for a long time. But the play pattern essentially ended up being like either your opponent feels completely blown out because their turn 3 play gets countered and you make a 2/2 flyer, or you draw it later and it's just Flash Windrake. Its polarity kind of made it something that just ended up being worth cutting. I think people really, it did feel really, really bad when you got like 4 spiked and also your opponent has like a meaningful creature in play. Pretty rough.
Oh yeah. You have best gets by color written here with nothing under it. Is that something you wanted to?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to toss out there to see if you guys like had like a card in each color that we got this year that you think were just like was like the best thing we got for the color, or like an exceptional get for the color.
That's an interesting question because I would have to look at the list pretty thoroughly. Are you talking about like as far as things that we would still be playing, not just like the absolute best card by color, like Mana Drain for blue or whatever?
No. I mean, like for us, like for our primary cube project, like what are your color favorites?
Let me. I don't know if you guys have ones to throw out while I look at the list real quick, but
Yeah, I can go off the top of my head. I haven't really thought of it, but thought it through really. But I'm looking at the list. I don't play the card a lot, but I think Delny is probably my favorite white card that we got this year, just because of all the cool things that it does and enables. We've tried a variety of different build arounds in the cube over the years, and most of them just don't end up hacking it. You know, Monastery's Mentor used to sit in this slot, and like Delny, like working out and being as cool as it is something that I'm super happy about. For blue, in terms of cards we're still playing, I know we keep harping on this card, but I think it's probably Intrude on the mind for me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we got Remand too. We should have shouted Remand.
We did
Foundations.
we did get Remand, which was a cool get. I also for blue, it has only been here for a very short period of time, but I think Sphinx of Forgotten Lore is a very cool card, and Doug has already called it broken. Um, Sphinx of Forgotten Lore, for those of you that don't know what it is because it's so new, it's got sick art, maybe my favorite Sphinx art ever. But it's 2 blue for a 3/3 flash flyer, and when it attacks, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn, which is pretty nice if you're playing a lot of like cheap interaction, cantrips, burn. I mean, you could even, time warp. You can do the time warp again if you really want to. For black, it's either Season of Loss, Marionette Apprentice, or I think the coolest little card that we got is probably Iridescent Vine Lasher. That's a sweet little duder. And then for red, I think Screaming Nemesis is like maybe the most powerful red card that we got. A Rabble Man is cool too, but I haven't gotten to play with it. But I mean, in terms of like being like a really defining, sweet, powerful card for me, it's probably Slick Shot. Looking through green, it's probably Bristly Bill is probably the most powerful. I wouldn't say it's like my favorite, but good old Bristles is cool.
Yeah, I think Bristly Bill is definitely the best green card we got this year.
Yeah,
I mean, Birds of Paradise is probably in that conversation, but
yeah, Birds is actually, now that you mention it, Tim, is definitely my pick for green. And in the multicolored section, for me, it's gonna have to be Repulsive Mutation as just like the coolest thing that we were like, let's try this, and it actually worked and is fucking sick. And it also makes me happy to see Baleful Strix hanging out in our list.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to go through each individual color because I've got a couple of cards at the end I want to talk about that are in some colors. I'll back up with you that Downey was cool. I've obviously talked about my love of Stoneforge Mystic. I think for red, Slick Shot was really cool, but I want to shout out, I know it's a little bit of a roulette, but I really like Amped Raptor. I think that the deck building constraint of trying to fit as few cards that cost 3 or more in your deck as possible, and the sort of power it gives you for doing that it's kind of fun. Like sometimes you just like you whiff entirely and it feels like crap, and then sometimes you hit big and you feel like you won the lottery. It's just amusing. And Bristly Bill's really fun to play. That card's been a blast to play. It's a bit of a nightmare to play against sometimes, but really enjoyed playing with it. I think Undead Sprinter in the Rakdos section was one that ended up playing out better than maybe some people were considering. So yeah, I think there were a number of really good pickups this year. Could go on and on about some of these cards.
I was just looking at Zoraline, and I remembered how we cycled through like every 3 mana black-white rare that we got from every set this year. We went from like something to Teysa to Comball to the, yeah. I'm also not going to go by color, but I will say specifically in blue, 2 cards that stand out to me are Kitza Otterball Elite, because there's like a dream to this card on top of just being like baseline great as a looter and like prowess creature. And then Mischievous Mystic is a card I want to shout out. Because it replaced a MH2 card, which was Emrakul's Messenger, but also like this sort of design is really neat, right? 2 mana, 2/1 flyer. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, make a body. In this case, make a 1/1 flyer or make a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn that can sack for mana. Like I don't think we had seen something like this before on like a decent evasive stat line, and it does, like, if enough of this happens, it might actually open up like some new archetype territory.
Yeah, Fairy Vandal kind of fits into this space. It's different. It goes tall instead of wide, obviously, but Fairy Vandal is a card that we're not playing, but I think like we could play, and I think it would be a fine card.
Oh, you know what? I want to throw a shout out to Plume Creed Escort. I think that
Yeah.
card is low-key one of my favorite cards. I know that the whole like bogglesy protection thing is super annoying to play against, but I really enjoy playing with these cards. I think they're super fun.
Yeah, Plume Creed's cool. Yeah, if you take anything away from our experience, guys, it's that your blue creatures should have the words flash or flying or both on them whenever possible.
Right. Teld, I would actually prefer if you did the your favorite. You had some favorites you wanted to mention before I wrap up with these little awards.
Yeah, so I think my 3 favorite cards of the year ended up being Cryptic Coat, which I know I've talked a ton about Intrude, but Cryptic Coat's kind of the other MKM blue banger that I haven't talked as much about because I was waiting for this part. Card is just really, really powerful, but it's also really fun. So
Yeah,
like,
why don't you read the card, because we haven't actually said what this card does, but we brought it up like 3 times.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's 2 and a blue for an artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you cloak the top card of your library and then attach Cryptic Coat to it. So Cloak is just manifest, but it has Ward 2. And then it gets +1/+0 and can't be blocked. And for 1 and a blue, you can return Cryptic Coat to its owner's hand. So this card has a couple of things going on for it that make it just super engaging and fun to play for the person playing it, not necessarily to play against it. But basically, it's great on curve if you're proactive, right? It's a great way to spend your mana and then get a clock going, kind of like we mentioned with the Sphinx. It's got good protection for the early game, so it's difficult to interact with the creature. It's going to chip in damage over time. Pairs really well if you played a 2-drop flyer and then you play this and then you just go into full interaction mode because you've got a really good clock. But it's tutorable off Stoneforge, which I think it is the best Stoneforge target. Dissection Tools is arguable, but I think it is the best Stoneforge target. Because the other side of that returning Cryptic Coat to its hand means that if you get in a protracted, grindy game, Cryptic Coat goes from being a good tempo play to a very good attrition tool. So it plays both sides of the spectrum extremely well. So just a really, really fun, flexible card. I think this is the kind of card that is, like I said, it is frustrating to play against because you kind of get stuck into being able to race it or blow it up while they're tapped out. And those are really your only options. But the card hasn't proven to be so powerful that it's problematic, especially given that this cube tends to be extremely proactive and efficient.
Yeah, you can run it over if you're ahead of them.
Yeah. So Chainsaw is another one that I've really enjoyed, another equipment for Stoneforge, but I think this one is really just ended up being like, this card reads kind of boring. This kind of has Adult Gold Dragon energy for me, where it doesn't read like a particularly interesting card. It's good, but it turns out just being able to interact early and then have a way to scale up your little dudes, especially in the sort of, we've talked about how these black sack dudes, the like Blood-Soaked Champions of the world, are not particularly good. But when you spend a little extra mana and turn them into like a 10-1, suddenly you're just putting your opponent on the abyss. So it's a great way to spend mana into the late game. While also just being a good card. I think it gives a lot of in-game viability to some weaker decks in this cube. And then finally, I think my actual favorite card this year is Repulsive Mutation. And if you had asked me when MKM comes out that would be my opinion, I would have told you were insane. But I love this card. Man, I just want to put Repulsive Mutation in anything that can cast it. It's so sweet. When you're ahead, this card makes you just feel like you truly feel like you're just infinite power. I've got this game on lock. And the only time I've actually lost when I've untapped with a Repulsive Mutation in hand and was not just dead on board is when I have personally messed up casting my Repulsive Mutation. Not like misclicked
Which
it,
happens
but just
a
played
lot.
it poorly. Yeah,
I've seen that happen like 5 times.
It's a card that like you can, because sometimes you want to do the like, I'm going to go in with it. And you just like, all right, there's like not a lot of things they could have here. And if they've got the Path to Exile, right? And they get you with your Repulsive Mutation when you go for lethal, you get got really badly. If you don't counter the right thing, you can still lose a game. But if you're ahead when you get this card set up, it is so powerful. Usually it leads to you getting more board presence while beating their best play. It just enables my favorite deck in the cube while also being just good in a number of other, just like, it is a blue-green card that is worth splashing if you are able to get the mana for it.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's like, it's a counter spell and it's a fireball and it's just like everything. And I think exactly what I said the first time we talked about the card was, I knew Simic Flash was like not a deck, but if it was ever going to happen, this was exactly the type of print that I would sort of want to see for it. And then it sort of just became apparent, like, no, this is actually a pretty good card. And the other thing that I like about Repulsive Mutation, just kind of theoretically, is I made a joke earlier that the only thing that Wizards ever seems to be able to think to do with Simic is, oh, it explores. You draw cards and you play lands, and sometimes you gain life. It explores, right? And it always just kind of ends up being this like kind of dorky, rampy like value deck thing. But the decks that we've been putting Repulsive Mutation in this year have made me feel really strongly that I want Wizards to go back to exploring Simic's identity as a color pair as being like a tempo oriented deck, combining sort of like green stats and board lethality with blues like disruption. And I think that this card like perfectly encapsulates that. I'm going to give Teld the vast majority of the credit because, as the name of the deck implies, I was kind of fucked up. But essentially, drafting and creating and realizing that this like Bant kind of tempo, disruptive, proactive creature deck archetype was possible and present in the cube, and something that could be thought about and reinforced further, like as designers, was probably my favorite game design moment like of my quote unquote career. So yeah, this card has a lot of resonance with me for a bunch of different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Chris, you added a section stuff you want to see.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, this section is smaller than it's ever been for. I mean, I guess each passing year you get more stuff. It would be nice. Speaking of the Repulsive Mutation stuff that we were just talking about, it would be nice to see just a good green flash creature or two next year. It would be interesting to see how it fit in, but it would be nice to have like one or two more green like flash tools.
Like a 2024 version, or a 2025, I guess, version of Ambush Pack Leader or whatever. I forget the name of it, but
yeah, Night Pack Ambusher, or it would be cool to see like a Mystic Snake that is actually like playable, unlike Mystic Snake.
You know what's going to happen, right?
Huh?
The monkey paw is curling again. You're going to get exactly what you want, but it's going to be the Green Goblin from Spider-Man.
Oh no!
Oh man. Yeah, I hope that they don't put me in a position where I feel forced to play that. Actually, I'm going to come out and say it right now. We would not.
You know what? I know we've said we wouldn't, but as soon as they give us a card that I'm just like, yeah, this is sweet. That opinion is going to change for all of us when we start getting that. When you're like, the Green Goblin, it's a green card that has flash, and it does, and it makes your opponent's card smaller or whatever. It's a great flash disruptive creature, and we're gonna be like, all right, I guess we're playing it.
Yeah.
Oh man! All right, well, let's wrap this up with my little award ceremony. So everybody else, shut up! Everybody in the room, shut up! I got two awards that I always give out at the end of the year, and a new one that I have to give out. But at the moment, everyone's been waiting for. Give a little drum roll there. So the Chains of Mephistopheles Award. This is a prestigious award that goes out to a reasonably powerful card that you read and makes you say, what the fuck does this do? Named after Chains of Mephistopheles. You can go look that card up yourself. But I landed on two cards. One that I had pegged at the very beginning of the year, which is not a card that we've cubed with and probably never will. But I just want to read this text on this card. So the runner-up Chains of Mephistopheles Award goes to Kaya Spirit's Justice from MKM, which I'm going to go ahead and stop after the static ability, but I'm just going to read this out loud. Whenever one or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. And then, obviously, that's just a static ability, so Kaya has three other abilities that add on to this confusion. But, yeah, that's just what I don't even, like, I think what this is doing is it's doing this weird reanimator thing where your tokens become copies of creatures that get removed from your graveyard, but that's just so dumb and nebulous to start with. But the real Chains of Mephistopheles winner had to go to Nadu Winged Wisdom. It had to go to this card because it only triggers twice each turn, right? Just a quick reminder on the text. Nadu Winged Wisdom has flying, and it says creatures you control have, quote, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn, quote. And those quotation marks really fuck this card up. So, yeah.
If you don't know, or if you don't understand exactly why Nadu is a Chains of Mephistopheles card, go watch the Pro Tour this card was legal in, and watch the best players in the entire world trying to figure out what the hell they're supposed to do.
It's funny how many times we read this card, and every time we reread it, we're like, oh, it does. Oh, it works for all your creatures. Oh, It's twice each turn for each creature. Oh, it triggers on your opponent's stuff. It triggers on spells and abilities. Like it's just every single knob is turned on. Like every light switch is turned on. Yeah, the land comes in untapped, so I can go infinite. Like, come on now. So yeah, Nadu gets the Chains of Mephistopheles award this year. The Adult Gold Dragon award, much more prestigious, much nicer cards. This award goes to a clean text box, a card that is eminently cubable, but is extremely understandable and clean to read. And a couple contenders here. Seer Slicer Goblin, 1 in a red for a 2/1. At the beginning of your end step, if you attacked with a creature, make a 1/1 Goblin. Secure the Wastes, we just got that. I don't really want to give the reward to this one because it's a reprint, but white X, create X 1/1 white warrior creature tokens.
Doesn't get a whole lot simpler than that.
Yeah, that's, I mean, this would win if it wasn't a reprint. And then Mischievous Mystic, which I mentioned already. 2 mana, 2/1 flying. When you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1. I did not purposefully pick out a bunch of cards that make 1/1 tokens.
Oh, I assumed that you had. But...
No, that was completely by accident. And actually, you just deleted it, but I think Eldrazi processor or whatever it's called is a good shout out too. That's the 3 mana 3/3 that makes a 1/1 Scion when you cast it and when it dies.
Oh, I didn't mean to delete that, but yes, that is a
no.
I
deleted it because I recognized that Spawn and Scion were two different things, and so it's not as clean of a text box as quite what these have.
Oh yeah, it wouldn't win for sure, but I think Seer Slicer Goblin just gets the award this year. Like, it's a 2 mana 2/1 that makes 1/1s if you attacked. That seems pretty simple enough. And that's a pretty good Adult Gold Dragon. And then to wrap things up here, the Lantern Bearer Award for the mopiest worst card that we played for more than a day in our cube.
Usually we would have some runner-ups for this one, but this year there was a clear winner.
There was a
both,
clear winner.
Both the mainline and the Peasant Cube. This is going to be a double award winner.
Yep, that goes to Seasoned Warren Guard, the 1 mana 1/2 from Bloomburrow. When it attacks while you control a token, it gets +2/+0, which our reasoning was that, hey, a 3/2 is a pretty good body for 1 mana, but A, it's not online all the time, and B, it's a 1/2 when you're not doing that. Right. With no other text. So,
and C, what came up a lot, it doesn't block as a 3/2.
It doesn't. And nobody even wanted to try this card out, which was a huge bust, which there was a thought here. There was a line of reasoning to playing it, but yeah, this one was a complete bust. So Lantern Bearer of 2024 goes to Seasoned Warren Guard. So I'm going to ask the same question I asked at the beginning of the episode just to wrap things up, and then I'll close this out. How did 2024 fare for Cube?
I think it was a good year. I wish MH3 hadn't happened, but the nice thing about cubing, as everyone who cubes knows, is you get to decide what you want to engage with. I think that we have a very large number of spots on the curve in different colors where we just have like more good options than we know what to do with. We have a lot of prints that are sort of at the power level in the mainline cube that we consider appropriate. Yeah, I mean, I think the cube feels like it's in a pretty good spot overall. That's my take. And I'd have to say that the biggest thing for me overall, cube-wise, was we got the full cycle of fetches and surveil lands, and that just, the mana base feels different than it ever has in a way that I'm into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this was a very good year for Cube. I think this was a banner year for a lot of effects that we got that I'm very excited to be playing with. I've not drafted the Cube quite as much, not necessarily super recently, but like, lately I've been a little off of Magic just because of things outside of specifically Cube that has just kind of had me playing a little less. But when I've played the Cube, it's been very, very fun. Really enjoyed what's going on. And then secondly, I think up until like late October or November, I was very excited about the year. I think this, this year's lineup of sets were very good up until we got to Foundations and Pioneer Masters. I think both of these sets have been kind of mid, both for Cube and for retail. And then when you stack on top of it, the Universes Beyond, Foundations of next year, of next year's Magic or whatever that they did, that really set us off into a full-blown rant. I think my opinion of Magic kind of crashed near the end of the year, but I don't think that affects my opinion of Cube so much as it just has me, kind of less excited to play regularly. And I go through phases much like everybody, you know, where sometimes I'm playing Magic every single day and sometimes I'm playing it, you know, much less frequently. But I still think this was an overall very good year for Magic, even if I'm very worried about the future. And I think the end of this year from that, like I said, that Foundations, Pioneer Masters, both of those sets being kind of whatever, has ended the year kind of less than optimistic, but overall very good year.
Yeah, apprehensive about next year, but happy with everything we got this year. And I am of the opinion Pioneer Masters is a really good limited format, so I don't even have that apprehension. Foundation sucks ass, though. So that's it. That's it for 2024. We wrapped up. We talked about literally everything that happened during the year and missed nothing at all. So we'll go ahead and just remind everybody that you can find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld on twitch.tv/Teld Talks, TELD Talks, also on YouTube, Teld Talks. And yeah, that's going to go ahead and do it for the year. Nice wrap up for everybody, and we will be back with a peasant superlative type episode as a bonus episode for 2024. But beyond that, as far as Chris, Teld, and myself go, we will see everybody in 2025.
Take it easy, folks.
Take care.
You know, offspring and entwine and buyback and extort, escalate and monstrosity and replicate and squad. But do you recall the most famous kicker mechanic of all? Morph is not that cool of a mechanic. Please stop fucking bringing it back. Okay. Okay, that's enough of that. Merry Christmas and happy holidays, everyone.